The wagon wheels cracked against frozen ground like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. Evelyn sat on the bench with her youngest pressed against her left side and her second youngest against her right, both of them wrapped in the same wool blanket that had been her mother's and smelled now mostly of wood smoke and desperation. The older children rode in the bed behind her. She could hear them shifting, hear the older ones telling the younger ones to stay down out of the wind. She didn't turn around to check. She trusted them to manage because she had no other choice. She'd been trusting them to manage for 8 months now, since the morning she'd walked into the barn and found Thomas on the floor. 8 months. It felt like a different life. It felt like yesterday. The horse, a roan gelding named Prophet, which Thomas had named as a joke and which had long stopped being funny, pulled them through a corridor of pine that gradually thinned as the trail climbed. The mountains ahead were blunt and white and enormous in a way that made Evelyn feel like a mistake, like something too small to have survived this far. Cole Mercer rode 20 yards ahead on a gray horse that never seemed to tire. He hadn't said much since they'd left Billings. He'd pointed out landmarks occasionally, that ridge, that river bend, 2 more hours, and she'd nodded each time without really looking at where he pointed. She'd been watching him instead, watching the way he sat in the saddle, the way his shoulders never quite relaxed, the way he'd scan the tree line without making it obvious he was scanning anything. A careful man. Or a guilty one. She hadn't yet decided which. She'd met Cole Mercer 6 weeks ago in a general store in Billings, standing in an aisle she had no business standing in because she couldn't afford anything on those shelves. He'd been behind her when she'd put back the tin of condensed milk, put it back slowly, the way you do when you're hoping nobody notices. And he'd said, without any particular drama, "You can take it." She turned around, ready to be offended, and found a man in his early 40s with a weathered face and dark, careful eyes who didn't look like he was performing kindness. He looked like he was just saying a true thing. "I don't take charity," she'd told him. "I didn't call it charity," he'd said. She'd bought the milk with her own money, the last of a small cache she'd been rationing, and he'd followed her outside, which should have frightened her, but somehow didn't. He'd introduced himself. He'd asked how many children she had without making it sound like an accusation. He'd told her about the ranch in Red Hollow, about needing a wife who was practical rather than decorative, his words, about the house having 4 bedrooms and more space than one man could reasonably fill. "You're proposing to a stranger in a parking lot," she'd said. "Hitching post," he'd corrected. "And I'm proposing to a woman who just put back a tin of condensed milk so her children could eat something else instead. I'm not a romantic man, Mrs. Harper, but I'm not blind." She'd said no twice over the following week. She'd said no while her children ate flour gravy for the 3rd dinner in a row. She'd said no while her second son, Daniel, who was 13 and large for his age, and already half convinced he needed to leave school and find work, had looked at her across the table with eyes that were too old and hadn't said anything because he was too smart and too kind to say the thing he was thinking. She'd said yes on a Thursday morning, alone in the room she rented above the hardware store, staring at the ceiling while the wind came through the gap under the door. She wasn't under any illusion that this was love. She wasn't sure it was even hope. It was arithmetic. She had 9 children aged 4 to 15, $4 and change, 2 weeks left on the room, and winter settling in like it intended to stay. Cole Mercer had a house and a ranch and, as far as she could tell, no immediate plans to be cruel. In the calculus of survival, that was enough. She'd told the children the same night. Luke, the oldest at 15, had said nothing for a long time. Then he'd asked, "Do you know anything about him?" "Some," she'd said. "What do you know?" "He doesn't drink. He doesn't raise his voice. He had a wife before who passed." "How'd she pass?" She'd looked at her son, at the jaw that was already starting to square off the way Thomas's had, at the steady way he held her gaze, and she'd said, "I didn't ask." Luke had nodded slowly. He hadn't said she was making a mistake. He was too careful for that, too deliberate. But he hadn't said she was doing the right thing either, and the silence between those two positions was where they'd lived for the rest of that week. Red Hollow appeared first as a smear of smoke against the pale sky, then as a collection of low buildings arranged along a main street that looked like it had been dropped there rather than built. The town sat in a valley with mountains pressing in from 3 sides, and a frozen river running along the 4th, and the whole thing had the feeling of somewhere that had survived rather than thrived. Cole pulled up at the edge of town and waited for the wagon to come alongside him. "Stay close," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the street. Why? He didn't answer right away. He clicked his horse forward and she followed, and that was when Evelyn noticed it. The way the street went quiet. Not quiet the way a small town gets when strangers pass through. That idle, curious quiet. This was something else. People stopped moving. A man outside the barber shop put his hand on the door and didn't go in. Two women on the opposite boardwalk turned their faces away, but not before Evelyn caught the expression on one of them, something that lived between pity and alarm. A boy of about 12 ran off a porch and disappeared between buildings like he'd been told to report something. "Cole," Evelyn said. "I know." "What's happening?" "People have long memories out here," he said, "and they like to use them." Her children had gone very quiet behind her. She could feel it without looking. That particular quality of stillness that children produce when they sense something wrong and don't yet know whether to be frightened or curious. Her youngest, May, who was 4 and had Thomas's red hair and Thomas's tendency to say the true thing at the worst moment, pressed her face into Evelyn's coat sleeve. They stopped in front of a building with a sign that read, "Alderman's Supply." Cole dismounted and went inside without explanation, leaving Evelyn on the wagon bench in the middle of a street that was trying hard to pretend she wasn't there. Luke climbed over the bench and sat beside her. "You seeing this?" he said quietly. "I'm seeing it. These people are afraid of him. Or cautious," she said, because she felt she should offer the alternative. But even as she said it, she knew Luke was closer to right. Cautious people look at strangers sideways. Afraid people look at the ground. Cole came out of the supply store with a middle-aged man behind him who introduced himself, reluctantly, as Frank Alderman. Frank had thin, colorless hair and the kind of face that had made too many calculations and enjoyed too few of them. "Mrs. Harper," Frank said, in a tone that made her name sound like something he was handling carefully. "Welcome to Red Hollow." He looked at the children with an expression she couldn't quite read. "All of these are yours." "Every one," she said. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when you're thinking something you've decided not to say. "You'll need to get settled before dark. Road to the ranch gets bad when the temperature drops." "Then we won't keep you," Cole said. Frank's eyes went to Cole and something passed between the two men, something with a history she wasn't part of. And then Frank went back inside without another word. Cole mounted up. They moved through town and Evelyn watched the faces that were watching her without watching her. And she added up the things she knew and the things she didn't, and the total came out wrong. A woman stopped them near the far edge of town. She stepped right out into the street, deliberately, not by accident, and put her hand on the wagon horse's bridle. She was perhaps 50, with a broad, sun-damaged face and gray hair pinned under a practical hat, and she looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not afraid of anything. "Mrs. Harper," she said. Not a question. "That's right. Ruth Caswell. I run the boarding house." She paused. "I want to ask you something plainly, and I hope you'll answer me the same way." "Go ahead." "Do you know how Margaret Mercer died?" The name hit the air and stayed there. Evelyn saw Cole's back go rigid 20 yards ahead. He'd heard. He didn't turn around. "I know she passed," Evelyn said carefully. "She fell," Ruth said, "from the upper landing of the house at the ranch, in January, 3 years ago, in the middle of a snowstorm, with no reason any soul has ever been able to explain to bring her up there at that hour." She looked at Evelyn steadily. "Cole was home that night. He was always home." "Ruth," Cole had turned the horse around. His voice was flat and controlled. "That's enough." "I'm speaking to your wife," Ruth said without looking at him. "She's not my wife yet." "Then I'm speaking to a woman who deserves the truth before she becomes one." Ruth's eyes came back to Evelyn and stayed there. "I'm not saying what happened. I'm saying nobody in this town knows what happened. And I'm saying you've got children, Mrs. Harper, and I think you're a woman of sense." She let go of the bridle. "The boarding house is on the main street. If you ever need a night away from the ranch, the door is always open." She stepped back onto the boardwalk and went inside without another word. Evelyn sat very still for a moment. Behind her, the wagon was very quiet. She could hear May breathing. Then she clicked the reins and moved Prophet forward. The ranch was larger than she'd expected. That was the first thing. She'd imagined something modest, a working man's spread, functional and plain. What she saw instead, as the wagon came around a bend in the road and the valley opened up, was a main house of 2 stories built from dark timber, a bunkhouse, 3 outbuildings, 2 barns, and fencing that ran in every direction as far as the light allowed her to see. The land itself was extraordinary. Even in the grip of winter, she could see what it would be in spring, the way the valley held and sheltered, the way the creek would run full along the near edge. "This is yours," she said. It came out flat. "Our name is on it," Cole said. He was watching her reaction. She could feel it. "Mercer Ranch. My father's father built the main house. I've added to it." "You told me you had a ranch." "I do." "You didn't tell me it was—" She stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish that. This size, this value, this much to lose. "Would it have changed your answer?" he asked. She thought about that for a moment. "No, but it changes the questions." He didn't ask her what questions. He turned his horse toward the house and said, "Come on, I'll get the stove going." The children came alive when they saw it. Even the older ones, who had learned to restrain their reactions, had their faces do the thing that children's faces do when something unexpectedly good appears. Her son Daniel, 13 and recently grim, said, "That's a real house," in a way that made something hurt in her chest. Her daughter Clara, who was 10 and had been the most quietly miserable throughout the whole journey, put her hand on Evelyn's arm without saying anything. Only Luke didn't react. He looked at the house, and then he looked at Cole, and then he looked at Evelyn, and his expression was the one she'd been seeing more often in the past 8 months, the one that had too much Thomas in it, too much of that careful reading of situations that Thomas had always done that she'd always loved, and occasionally found exhausting. "I'll take care of the horse," Luke said. He took the reins and didn't look at Cole. The house was cold but solid. The kitchen was large enough to cook for 12 people, which was just about right. The bedrooms were clean, if sparse. Someone had kept the place in order. The floors were swept, there were no animal droppings, the windows were intact. And Evelyn didn't yet know if that was Cole's doing or someone else's, but she noted it. Cole built the fire in the kitchen stove without being asked, and then he built the fire in the front room, and then he said he would bring in supplies from the wagon and left her alone in the kitchen with her children and the smell of burning pine and the settling quiet of a house coming back to warmth. "Mama?" That was 7-year-old Henry, who had an instinct for saying the thing nobody else would say. "Did that lady in town say somebody died here?" "We're fine," Evelyn said. "That's not what I asked. Henry." That was Clara, quiet and firm. Henry looked at his older sister and made the calculation that most 7-year-olds make in the presence of a 10-year-old sibling who outweighs them, and decided to let it go. Evelyn put a pot of water on the stove and went to the window that faced the yard. Through the glass, she could see Cole moving between the wagon and the house in the failing light, carrying boxes and bundles with the efficiency of a man used to working alone. She watched him for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the way he moved without wasting motion, without performing anything for an audience. She thought about Ruth Caswell in the street. Nobody in this town knows what happened. She thought about the way the boardwalk had cleared. She thought about Luke's face when he'd said these people are afraid of him. She thought about the upper landing. She hadn't asked Cole about his first wife. She hadn't asked because she'd been afraid the answer would force a decision she wasn't ready to make, and because she'd needed a roof over her children's heads more badly than she'd needed a clear conscience. That was the honest truth of it, and she'd been sitting with it for 6 weeks. She would have to ask him. Not tonight. Tonight was logistics, was warmth, was 9 children eating something hot before they slept in a real bed for the first time in months. But soon. The door opened and Cole came in with 2 crates and set them on the kitchen table. He looked at her by the window. "You're thinking about what Ruth said," he said. "Would you rather I wasn't?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret fell. I don't know why she was on that landing. I don't know why she was up in the middle of the night. I've asked myself those questions for 3 years and I don't have answers for them." He set his hands on the back of a kitchen chair. "I know what people think. I've been living inside what people think for 3 years. Evelyn looked at him. "Did you love her?" Something moved through his face. Not grief exactly, more like the memory of grief, the shape of it rather than the weight. Yes, he said. I did. Was she happy here? He took longer with that one. She was for a while, then something changed. About a year before she died, she was worried about something. She wouldn't tell me what it was. I thought, he stopped. I thought it was us. I thought it was something about our marriage. That's what I've thought for 3 years, but now I'm not certain that's right. Evelyn turned back to the window. The yard was dark now, the mountains beyond it blacker than the sky. What do you think it was? She asked. I don't know yet, he said, but I think maybe she found something she wasn't supposed to find. He picked up the crates and went into the pantry, and Evelyn stood at the window with the fire warming her back and her children's voices behind her, and she felt the shape of it, this thing she had walked her family into without knowing what it was, this silence that had dimensions she couldn't yet see, this house that held a dead woman's questions. She'd made her choice. She was here. The water was boiling. She turned from the window and got to work. The snow came during the night, silent and heavy, and by morning the ranch was buried under 8 inches of it, with more falling. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window before anyone else was awake, holding a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm while she wasn't paying attention, watching the white accumulate on the fence posts and the barn roof and everything else Cole owned, and she thought, this is what I chose. Not with bitterness, just with the plain recognition of a woman who had stopped pretending she understood all the consequences of her decisions before she made them. The children woke in stages. May 1st, as always, padding into the kitchen with her blanket trailing and her red hair compressed on one side from sleep. Then Henry. Then the middle ones in a loose, grumbling cluster. Clara came in last among the younger ones and immediately began helping Evelyn with the oats without being asked, which was the thing Clara always did, and which Evelyn was always grateful for, and had never adequately said so. Luke didn't come in for breakfast. She found him in the barn. He was brushing Prophet with the same methodical, unhurried attention he gave to everything. The roan stood patient under his hands. The barn smelled of hay and horse and cold, and the light came in gray through the gaps in the siding. You should eat, Evelyn said. I will. She stood in the doorway for a moment. You're angry. He didn't stop brushing. I'm not angry. You've got your father's way of being angry, she said, which is to say you don't look at it all, and it comes out sideways 3 days later. He stopped then. He turned around. He was as tall as Thomas now, had gotten there over the summer while she hadn't been watching, while she'd been too consumed with the business of grief and survival to notice. And it still caught her off guard sometimes, that height, the broadness of his shoulders. I just want to know if you trust him, Luke said, not whether it was the right decision. I know why you made it. I understood it before we left Billings, but I want to know if you actually trust him. I don't know him well enough to trust him. Then what are we doing here? We're eating oats this morning instead of nothing, she said. We're sleeping in beds instead of a rented room, and I'm going to get to know him well enough to trust him or well enough to know I can't. That takes time, Luke. Everything true takes time. He looked at her for a moment with those 2 old eyes, and then he turned back to the horse. I talked to one of the ranch hands yesterday evening, he said. Before supper. Fellow named Pete. He's been here 4 years. What did he say? Said Cole is a fair employer, pays on time, doesn't drink, doesn't rage. A pause. Said Margaret was kind, said she used to bring coffee out to the hands in the mornings. That's something. Said about a year before she died, she started asking the hands questions. About land, about the boundaries, about which ranches had sold in the valley and who'd bought them. Pete said he thought she was just curious. Didn't think anything of it until after. Luke turned around again. That's not a woman who fell off a landing for no reason, Mama. That's a woman who was looking for something. Evelyn heard Cole's words from the night before settle into a different shape. I think maybe she found something she wasn't supposed to find. She'd thought he was speculating. Maybe he wasn't. Don't do anything with that yet, she said. I'm not doing anything. I mean it, Luke. I heard you. He picked up the brush again. I'm just telling you what I know. She went back to the house through the snow. The first 2 weeks had their own texture, hard and unfamiliar, like breaking in new boots. Evelyn organized the household the way she'd always organized households, by assigning tasks that matched what people were actually capable of, rather than what was theoretically fair, by finding the rhythm of a place before trying to change it, by not announcing what she was doing so that people couldn't object before they'd seen whether it worked. The ranch hands, there were 3 of them, Pete and 2 younger men named Cal and Dixon, watched her with a wariness that was not unfriendly, just careful. They'd had a system before she arrived, and she'd disturbed the equilibrium of it, not through anything she'd done deliberately, but simply by existing in a space that had been, for 3 years, purely male and purely functional. She didn't try to rush them past it. Cole stayed mostly out of her way during those first weeks, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. He managed the ranch and let her manage the house, and in the evenings after supper he would sometimes sit in the front room and read while the children moved around him, and he had the quality, rare in men in her experience, of being genuinely comfortable with noise. He didn't flinch at it, didn't try to quiet it, just absorbed it like weather. She caught him watching the children sometimes, never with anything that seemed threatening. It was more like study, like a man trying to understand something he hadn't encountered before. One evening, she came into the front room and found May sitting next to him on the settee, uninvited, looking at the book he was reading. Cole had gone still in the careful way adults do when a small child has appeared beside them unexpectedly and they're not sure of the protocol. "What's it about?" May asked. "Rivers?" he said. "Real ones?" "Mostly." "Do rivers have names?" "Most of them." May considered this. "What's that one called?" She pointed at a map in the book. "The Missouri." "That's a funny name." "Maybe the river thinks your name is funny." May looked at him sideways, deciding whether this was worth being offended by, and then decided it was funny instead and laughed, that quick, whole-body laugh she had. And Cole looked, just for a moment, like something had surprised him, like he'd forgotten a thing could be that simple. Evelyn went back to the kitchen without saying anything. Hosek. It was Pete who first told her about Judge Harlan Cobb. They were in the barn, Evelyn repairing a bridle that had split along the cheek strap, Pete patching a section of stall board, and the conversation had been the easy, practical kind that happens between people working with their hands. Then it shifted. "You're going to hear about Cobb," Pete said. He said it without preamble, still looking at his work. "Better you hear about him right than hear about him sideways." "All right. He's the territorial judge. Has been for 12 years. Sits out of Harlow City, 40 miles north. But he has interest out here. Land interests." Pete drove a nail. "The valley here. This whole section's. There were 6 ranches running here 15 years ago. 4 of them are gone now. Families sold off or left. 2 of them didn't leave willingly, is what people say." "What happened to them?" "One family had a barn fire, lost most of their stock and decided to sell. Another family, the tenants, their water got fouled. Upstream, somebody, and nobody ever said who officially, dammed a side creek that fed their pasture. By the time the thing was sorted out legally, they'd gone broke and had to sell to cover debts." He looked at her now. "Both properties sold to a holding company out of Helena. Nobody local owns shares in it. Nobody's ever been able to say officially that Cobb does either. But the man who handled both sales legally was Cobb's private attorney." He went back to his nailing. "Cole's ranch is the last large independent spread in this valley. His father held on when the others sold. Cole's held on since." Evelyn set the bridle in her lap. "And Margaret?" Pete's hammer paused, just briefly. "Margaret was... She cared about this place, more than some people understood. She cared about it the way Cole does, but she went about it different. More active. She asked questions Cole didn't think to ask." He paused. "About 2 months before she died, she told me she'd found paperwork. In town, at the county office. Said some of the deed transfers didn't look right. Said she thought there were signatures that weren't genuine on some of the sales documents." The cold in the barn seemed to intensify slightly, as if the temperature had dropped without the wind to announce it. "Did she tell Cole?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know. She didn't tell me much. Just enough that I knew she was worried. I think she was trying to be certain before she said anything to him." He drove the last nail and stood up slowly, his knees audible. Then she fell. Evelyn looked at the bridle in her hands, the split leather, the careful stitching she was putting into it. "Pete," she said, "where did she keep things?" Margaret. Did she have a desk, a box, somewhere she kept her papers? Pete was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There's a room at the back of the main house. Cole uses it for storage now. It was hers when she was alive." He picked up his tools. "I wouldn't go in without telling him why. Cole's a fair man, but he's got his own grief in that room. It deserves some respect." He left her with that. She told Cole that evening, not all of it, not yet, but the shape of it, that she'd spoken to Pete, that she knew about Cobb, that she understood the ranch was not simply a ranch, but a position being held against pressure. Cole listened without interrupting. He was at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him, and his face did the thing it did when something was serious. It went very still, not closed exactly, but contained. "Pete talks too much," he said when she finished. "Pete told me the truth," she said. "I'd rather have that than be kept comfortable until something I don't understand burns the barn down." He looked at her across the table. There was something measuring in it, but not unkind. "What do you want to know?" he said. "Did Margaret tell you what she'd found?" A pause. "She told me she thought there was something wrong with some of the land transactions in the valley. She didn't give me details. She said she needed to be sure before she said anything." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "We argued about it. I told her to leave it alone. I told her whatever had happened to the other ranchers was already done and there was no use in... I told her to let it go." He stopped. "That was the last real conversation we had before she died." The guilt of it was visible, not performed, not seeking sympathy, just there, the way a scar is there. "You think she didn't let it go?" Evelyn said. "I think she couldn't. It wasn't in her nature." "Do you think she found something substantial enough that someone would have wanted to stop her?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove settled. From somewhere above them, the house made the small sound old houses make in the cold. "Yes," he said. "I think that now. I didn't let myself think it before because..." He stopped again. "Because if she was killed, then the last thing I did was tell her to stop doing the thing that mattered to her. And that's something I've got to live with regardless of what happened. But yes, I think now that someone stopped her." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. "Margaret's room," she said. "The storage room. I'd like to look through it." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because she was careful," Evelyn said. "Pete says she was careful. She wouldn't have kept evidence where it could be easily found, but she also couldn't have destroyed it. She needed it to be found eventually, needed it to mean something, so she hid it. And if nobody's looked properly since she died, it might still be there." Cole was very still. Then he said, "I'll unlock the room in the morning." Margaret Mercer's room was not what Evelyn had expected. She'd expected it to be frozen in time, preserved, the way grief sometimes preserves things. But Cole had clearly used it as storage without sentimentality. Crates of equipment, boxes of ranch records, a rolled survey map leaning against one wall. Whatever of Margaret's had been in it had been pushed to the edges to make room for the practical. But the edges were where Evelyn looked. It took her 2 days, working through the room in the hours when the children were occupied and she could be there alone. She went through every box, every crate, looked at the backs of shelves, checked the floorboards for irregularities. She didn't tell Luke what she was doing. She didn't want him to have a reason to do something rash before she had something worth doing something rash about. She found it on the second day. It was inside the hollow cavity of a dried-out inkwell that sat on a small shelf with other dried-out or broken stationery items, the kind of shelf that advertises its uselessness so efficiently that nobody looks at it twice. Inside the inkwell, rolled tight and wrapped in oilcloth, was a folded sheet of paper. She sat on a crate and unrolled it in the cold light from the room's single window. It was a handwritten list, Margaret's handwriting. She'd seen it in the ranch ledgers Cole had shown her, neat and pragmatic. The list had 5 entries. Each entry had a name, a date, and a notation. 3 of the names she didn't recognize. One was Tennant, the family Pete had mentioned, the fouled water. And the 5th name was a man called Aldous Vickers, with a date from 4 years ago and a notation that read, "Signed deed, handwriting does not match county records from 1881. See Harlow City Deed Book, page 114. Below the list, in smaller letters, HC, Dalby is his man at the county office. Cobb takes 40% on each acquisition. Land values on resale. See separate. H.C. Harlan Cobb. Evelyn sat there for a moment with the paper in her hands and the cold coming through the walls and the sound of her children somewhere in the house above her, and she felt the particular quality of a thing that is both smaller and larger than you were prepared for. Smaller because it was just a list, handwritten, without official seals, without the weight of a court document. Larger because Margaret had hidden it inside a dried inkwell and was dead. She rolled it back into the oilcloth and put it in her coat pocket and went to find Cole. She found him in the yard, talking to a man she didn't recognize. A heavy-set man on a dark horse, wearing a coat that was too clean for the weather, which meant he hadn't ridden far from somewhere with a roof. The man was talking quietly. Cole's posture was the contained, careful kind that meant he was controlling a reaction. Evelyn stood on the porch and waited. After a minute, the man on the horse looked up at her, and his look was the deliberate kind. The kind that means, I see you and I want you to know I see you. And then he turned his horse and rode back toward the main road without looking back. Cole came to the porch. His jaw was set. Who was that? She asked. Name's Greer, Cole said. He works for Cobb. What did he want? Cole looked at the road where the man had gone. He said Cobb wants to make an offer on the ranch. Said Cobb had heard I'd taken a wife, said starting a family is expensive, said maybe this was a good time to reconsider my position. He said it flatly, the way you report a threat when you're trying to stay rational about it. What did you say? I said no. What did he say to that? Cole looked at her. He said he hoped I'd reconsider. He said accidents happen, especially in winter. He looked at the house when he said it. Evelyn put her hand in her coat pocket. The oilcloth was there under her fingers. Come inside, she said. I have something to show you. She spread the paper on the kitchen table between them. She watched Cole read it. She watched his face move through recognition and then through something colder. The retroactive understanding of things that had looked like accidents. She figured it out, he said quietly. Most of it. Enough of it. He touched the edge of the paper without picking it up. She came to me in October, a month before she died, and she asked me what I knew about Dalby at the county office. I told her nothing, that I barely knew the man. I didn't ask her why she wanted to know. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. I should have asked her why. You couldn't have known. Maybe. He straightened up. But I know now. And Cobb knows we're still here, and now Cobb knows there's a new woman in this house, and Cobb's man just looked at my front door and mentioned accidents. He was very still for a moment. This is going to get worse before it stops. Evelyn folded the paper carefully and put it back in the oilcloth. Then we need to be ready for worse, she said. Cole looked at her across the kitchen table. She couldn't tell if he was surprised by her, or relieved, or some combination of the two. Maybe all of that was the same thing at this point. I need to know something, he said. Ask. You've been here 2 weeks. You didn't come here looking for this. You came here to feed your children and find solid ground. He paused. If you want to take the children to Ruth Caswell's boarding house and sit this out until it's over, I won't hold it against you. I'll understand it. Evelyn looked at him. At the man who hadn't drunk in 4 years and paid his hands on time and gone still with surprise when a 4-year-old had laughed at a joke about rivers. The man who had told his wife to leave it alone and had lived with that for 3 years. Cole, she said, someone killed Margaret for finding this. We have it now. If we give it up or run from it, nobody else finds it. It just disappears again, and Cobb goes on taking what isn't his. She picked up the oilcloth and put it in her coat pocket again. Besides, that man looked at my house. She went to start the supper, and after a moment she heard Cole sit down at the table behind her, heavy and quiet, like a man who has just put down one weight and picked up another and is trying to decide whether the trade was worth it. Outside, the snow had started again. It came down straight in the windless afternoon, thick and even, covering the tracks that Greer's horse had left in the yard. By morning, there would be no sign he'd been there at all, but they both knew he'd be back. Greer came back 4 days later, and he didn't come alone. Evelyn was hanging laundry in the back of the house, a stubborn, pointless task in winter, but the children needed dry clothes and the kitchen couldn't hold everything, when she heard horses on the main road. She came around the side of the house and counted 3 riders moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing, the way men move when they want you to know they're not afraid of you. Greer was in the front. The two behind him were younger and wore their guns in a way that was meant to be noticed. Cole was already on the porch. He hadn't gone for his rifle. She noted that. He stood with his arms loose at his sides, watching. Greer pulled up at the yard fence. Mercer. Greer. Judge Cobb wanted me to follow up. He's a patient man, but he's a busy one. Greer's eyes moved to Evelyn, then back to Cole. He's prepared to be generous, given your new circumstances. The answer's the same as last time, Cole said. Things change. Not this. Greer looked at the house, at the window where two of the younger children had appeared, drawn by voices. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did, and Evelyn felt it move through her like cold water. Judge Cobb respects a man's right to make his own decisions, Greer said. He also respects consequences. He turned his horse without another word, and the two younger men turned with him, and the three of them rode back down the road in the same unhurried way they'd arrived. Cole stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then he said, without turning around, "Go inside, Evelyn." "Don't do that," she said. He turned. His face was tight. "I'm not trying to manage you. I'm saying it's cold and there's nothing to see." She went inside, but she stood at the front window and watched the road for a long time after. That night, she spread Margaret's list on the kitchen table again and looked at it alongside a survey map Cole had retrieved from the storage room, a detailed one of the valley and surrounding territory, with property lines marked in faded ink. Together they traced what Margaret had found: the 5 properties, the dates, the pattern of acquisition moving from the valley's edges inward like something tightening. Mercer Ranch sat at the center. "He needs this land specifically," Evelyn said, "not just any land." "Water rights," Cole said. He pointed to the creek on the map and to where it fed south from the mountains. "This creek is the primary water source for the entire lower valley. Whoever controls this property controls the water. The tenants found that out the hard way when their tributary was cut." He traced the line with his finger. "My grandfather knew what he had. That's why he built here. That's why Cobb wants it. And why he can't just take it. He's a judge. He needs it to look legal. Forged signatures, pressured sales, manufactured debt." Cole sat back. Margaret found the forgeries, Dalby at the county office. He's been altering deed records, backdating signatures, adjusting transfer documents. It would be nearly invisible unless you knew what you were looking for and you were comparing the handwriting carefully. Margaret knew what she was looking for. She was meticulous, more than I gave her credit for. He was quiet for a moment. "If we can get this list and the survey evidence to federal marshals, not territorial law, federal, Cobb's arrangement with local officials doesn't protect him. The forgeries are federal crimes. Land fraud at this scale is federal jurisdiction." "Where are the nearest federal marshals?" "Harlow City has a territorial office, but Cobb controls it. The nearest federal marshal's office with any independence is in Mill Haven." He paused. 40 miles. The mountain pass is the faster route in summer. In winter, it's... "How bad?" "Bad," he said. "Deep snow, narrow trail. You'd need a sure-footed horse in clear weather and someone who knows the way." "But possible." "Barely." Evelyn looked at the map, looked at the distance. "We need to make copies of this list," she said. "And we need to do it soon. If Cobb thinks we have something and he decides not to wait..." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Cole nodded. "I'll start tomorrow." Gut. What happened instead was this. 3 mornings later, before dawn, Pete came to the back door and knocked with the particular rhythm that meant something was wrong. Cole answered in his boots and his coat over his long underwear, and Pete said, low and quick, "There's men on the south fence, 2 of them, maybe 3. Dixon rode the perimeter at 4 and saw horses in the tree line." Cole was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. Evelyn stood in the kitchen in the dark and listened to the house. The children were all asleep. The fire in the stove was low but not out. She put more wood in it and moved to the front window and looked at the yard, where the snow was gray-blue in the pre-dawn dark, and nothing moved. Then she went and woke Luke. He was awake before she got the door fully open. She'd always suspected he slept lighter than he let on. He sat up and she could see him reading her face in the dim. "What's happening?" he said. Men on the south fence. Cole's gone to look. She kept her voice level. I need you up. He was out of bed without another word. He had his father's rifle. She'd given it to him 2 months after Thomas died, over the objection of some part of herself that wasn't ready, because the practical part had understood that a 15-year-old boy with a rifle was more useful than a 15-year-old boy without one when you were a widow with 8 other children. He checked it in the dark with the ease of someone who had been doing it long enough that it required no thought. Stay inside, she told him. Mama, inside, Luke, unless I call for you. You understand? He held her look. Then he nodded. She went back to the front window and waited. The dark outside slowly turned a shade less dark, and then she saw Cole coming back across the yard with Pete and Cal behind him. And the look on Cole's face was one she hadn't seen before. Not frightened, something more complicated than that. The look of a man who has just had his estimate of a situation revised considerably upward. He came inside and stood in the kitchen. She waited. It's not a few men, he said. Pete counted 6 in the south tree line. There's a wagon on the main road with 2 more, and he stopped. Greer left a message nailed to the fence post, written on courthouse stationery. He handed her a folded paper. She opened it. It was a warrant, or something made to look like one. Territorial courthouse seal at the top, Cobb's name at the bottom, and in the middle a charge of murder against Cole Mercer for the death of one Margaret Ann Mercer, with an order for immediate detention pending territorial court review. Evelyn read it twice. Her hands were steady. She was actually surprised they were. This is fabricated, she said. Of course it is, but it's got a seal and a signature, and in a territorial court with Cobb sitting on the bench, fabricated is close enough to legal to hold someone for months. Cole's jaw was tight. If they take me in, I don't get out. Not through Cobb's court. Not ever. Then you don't go in. If I refuse the warrant is forged, she said. We both know that, which means Cobb is done waiting and is moving to take the ranch. Whether you go in or you don't, the outcome is the same for him. At least if you're here, we have the evidence, and we have Cole Mercer standing on his own land. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of someone who thinks the way you need someone to think right now. He wants me off the property, Cole said, one way or another. I know. She set the warrant on the table. So we can't let you leave. Outside, the sky had lightened enough to show the mountains, white and enormous, in the east. Somewhere out in the trees, Cobb's men were waiting. Mount. The day passed in a state of suspended wrongness. The men in the tree line stayed where they were, far enough back to avoid a clear confrontation, close enough to be known. Cal rode out to the main road mid-morning and confirmed that the wagon was still there, with 2 men and, he thought, a third that had been inside the wagon bed. The children knew something was happening. She'd tried to keep it from them, and the effort had failed by mid-morning because children are better readers of adult faces than adults want to believe, and because the ranch hands moving differently, tighter, quieter, with their eyes toward the fence lines, was not something that escaped notice. She gathered them in the kitchen and told them something that was the truth without being all of it. That there were some men outside who were unhappy about the ranch, and that it was important to stay inside and away from the windows until it was sorted. Henry asked if they were going to shoot at them, and she said no, which was a thing she didn't actually know, and he nodded in the way Henry nodded when he suspected he was being managed, but was choosing to accept it because the alternative was worse. May sat in the corner with a blanket around her shoulders and didn't ask anything, which was the one that scared Evelyn most. May always asked. Luke stayed in the front room with the rifle and said nothing. It was mid-afternoon when Evelyn found the second thing. She'd gone back to the storage room, Margaret's room, for the survey map, wanting to look at it again, wanting to understand if there was a route out of the valley that Cobb's men wouldn't be watching. She was moving crates to reach the rolled map in the back corner when she knocked a smaller crate off a shelf, and it hit the floor and broke open, and inside it, wrapped in the same oilcloth as the list, were papers. Not one paper. A packet of them. 8 or 9 sheets folded together. She sat on the floor of the storage room in her coat and read them. Margaret had been thorough in a way that went beyond the list. The papers contained hand-copied entries from what appeared to be deed ledgers, specific pages, specific entries, with notations in Margaret's neat hand identifying the discrepancies. On 3 of the entries, she had written the names of witnesses to the original transactions. People who had signed documents that the altered county records now showed different signatures for. Live witnesses. People who could testify that what was in the current county records was not what they had signed. There was also a letter addressed to a man named William Brace, federal marshal, Millhaven District. It was dated October 12th, 3 years ago. It said, "I have evidence of systematic land fraud operating under the authority of Territorial Judge Harlan Cobb. I will come to Millhaven personally to present it as soon as I am certain enough to speak." It was signed Margaret E. Mercer. She had never sent it. She had written it and kept it, and she had died less than a month later. Evelyn sat on the floor for a long time with the papers in her lap and the cold coming through the walls. Then she got up and went to find Cole. She found him with Luke, which she hadn't expected. They were both at the front window, Cole with his arms crossed, Luke standing slightly behind him to the left. And they weren't quite talking, but they weren't quite not talking either. The posture of it was something she recognized from Thomas and Luke in the years before Thomas died. Two people who weren't fully comfortable with each other, but had found a task they could occupy together. She put the papers on the small table by the window. Cole read them standing up. She watched his face work through it. The recognition, the grief moving underneath the recognition. The grief being put somewhere practical because there was no time for it right now. Luke read over Cole's shoulder and didn't comment until he'd read the letter. Then he said quietly, "She was going to go herself." "Yes," Evelyn said, "and somebody knew she was going to." "That would be my guess." Luke looked at his mother. He had the expression he'd had in the barn 2 weeks ago, the one that was reading ahead of the current moment. "We need to get this to Millhaven." "We do." "The road through town goes past Cobb's man at the county office. Whoever goes that way gets seen." He paused. "But the mountain pass doesn't go through town." "The pass is 40 miles of bad winter trail," Cole said. "I know," Luke said. He wasn't looking at Cole. He was looking at Evelyn. "I've been asking Pete about it. He wrote it 3 winters ago. He told me where the trail markers are." Evelyn felt something in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite pride, and was the uncomfortable combination of the two that she'd felt increasingly often since Thomas died, and Luke had started becoming someone she didn't entirely recognize. Someone more than she'd known how to prepare him to be. "Luke," she said. "There are 8 of them out there," he said, "and they've got a fake warrant for Cole, and they're going to wait until they think we're uncertain enough to make a mistake." He kept his eyes on her. "But there's only one way they can actually win this, and it's if the evidence doesn't get to anyone who can use it. So that's the problem we need to solve." Cole said, "He's right." Evelyn looked at Cole. "He's right," Cole said again. He didn't seem comfortable saying it, but he said it anyway. "I can't go. If I leave the property, Greer takes that as an opening and comes for the ranch. Pete and Cal and Dixon can hold the fence for a while, but not indefinitely, and not if Greer decides to escalate." He looked at Evelyn carefully. "And if you leave, there's no one here who knows what we know and can make decisions about what matters most." "He's 15, she said. "I know how old he is. The pass is—" "I know what the pass is." Cole's voice was steady. "And I know that boy has been steady since the day he got here. He hasn't panicked once. He's asked the right questions, and he's listened when Pete answered them, and he hasn't done anything rash when he had reason to." He paused. "I'm not telling you to send him. I'm telling you that he's the person, in this house, who can make that ride. You know it too." The room was very quiet. From somewhere in the back of the house, Evelyn could hear Clara telling the younger children a story. Something made up, soothing, the steady rhythm of it. She looked at her son, at the 15-year-old who had Thomas's jaw and Thomas's eyes, and something of his own that was neither of them. Some quality that had grown in the hard season of the last year, and that she wasn't sure she'd had anything to do with. That might have been there all along, waiting for necessity to call it forward. "If you go," she said, "you ride at night. You stay off the main trail where you can. You don't stop in Harlow City for any reason. You find Marshal Brace in Millhaven, and you put Margaret's letter in his hands first before anything else. Because it's addressed to him by name, and it came from a dead woman, and it will mean something to him before he's heard anything else." Luke was listening with the whole of himself. "Pete will give you the trail markers," she said. "You memorize them. You don't rely on written notes because notes can be taken." She paused. "And you don't be a hero on the mountain. You be boring and careful. You be the most boring, careful boy who ever rode 40 miles of winter trail. You hear me?" "Yes," he said. "Say it back." "Boring and careful. If the weather turns bad, I'll find shelter and wait it out." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she put the papers in the oilcloth, sealed it, and handed it to him. "I need you to come back," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended, with more of the actual thing underneath it. She didn't try to take it back. Luke looked at her. He was not going to cry. He hadn't cried since the day of Thomas's funeral, and she suspected he'd decided something about that, and it wasn't a decision she could undo. But something moved through his face that was the equivalent of it, something that acknowledged the weight of what she'd said and held it instead of dismissing it. "I know," he said. He left after midnight. Evelyn stood at the back window and watched the darkness where he'd gone until there was nothing to see. And then she stood there a while longer because there was nothing else she could do with her hands. Cole came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to tell her it was going to be all right, or that Luke was capable, or any of the things people say when they want to be useful and can't be. He just stood there in the dark kitchen beside her, and after a while she was glad of it. The simple fact of another person present, not fixing anything, just present. Outside, the wind had come up. It moved across the yard and lifted the snow in small, thin sheets and set them down again. Somewhere out in the tree line, Cobb's men were still there, waiting for morning. And on the mountain, somewhere in the dark above the valley, a 15-year-old boy who was trying to be boring and careful was riding towards something that could end all of this or end him. And Evelyn Harper stood at a window she could see nothing through and understood, for the first time with her whole body rather than just her mind, that there are moments in a life when all the love you have is exactly no protection at all. She stayed at the window until the sky started to go gray in the east. Then she went to make coffee, because morning was coming regardless, and there would be things to face in it, and she needed her hands occupied and her mind clear, and whatever was going to happen to her son was already happening. Beyond her reach, in the mountains she could see now beginning to emerge pale and enormous from the dark. She put the kettle on the stove and listened to the ranch wake up around her. The hands stirring in the bunkhouse, a horse moving in the barn, one of the younger children turning over in a bed upstairs, and she thought, "Hold on, Luke. Just hold on and be boring." The wind moved across the roof of the house and kept going north, toward the pass, toward the mountain. The morning after Luke left was the longest morning of Evelyn's life, and she had lived through the morning she'd found Thomas in the barn. She kept herself moving because stillness was not something she could afford. She made breakfast for 8 children, distributed tasks, checked that the younger ones stayed away from the windows, and did all of it with the surface competence of someone whose hands knew what to do, even when the rest of her was somewhere on a mountain in the dark. Clara watched her throughout breakfast with the careful, measuring look that Clara had inherited from nobody. It was entirely her own, that look, something she'd developed early and refined into a kind of quiet precision, and didn't say anything, which meant Clara understood and was choosing to be useful rather than expressive. Henry asked once, at the table, where Luke was, and Daniel, 13 and recently understanding the weight of being the second oldest, said errand in a tone that closed the subject, and Henry, to his credit, let it close. Cole came in from the yard at 7:30. Snow on his coat, jaw set, eyes telling her what he was working not to say out loud. "They've moved up," he said when the children were occupied. "South fence and east now. Greer's with them. And there's a man I don't recognize on a horse at the main road junction who isn't one of Cobb's usual people. He's watching the road north." North, the direction of the mountain pass. "Could they know?" she asked. "Greer's careful. He might have guessed we'd try to get word out." Cole poured himself coffee without sitting down. "If they know Luke's on that trail—" "He left before midnight. He had hours before they moved up." "I know." He drank. "I know." But knowing a thing and being settled by it were different, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Greer came to the yard fence at 10 in the morning, alone this time, without the theatrical presence of armed riders. Just him on his dark horse and his too clean coat, and the particular confidence of a man who believed the arithmetic was already solved. Cole went to the porch. Evelyn came with him. She'd made a decision about that after the last visit, and she wasn't revisiting it. Greer looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite surprise. He'd recalculated her, she could tell. She had the feeling she'd been a minor consideration in his planning up until now. "Mercer," he said, "I'm going to be plain with you, because I think you're a man who respects plainness." "Go ahead," Cole said. "The warrant stands. Judge Cobb is prepared to bring the matter to territorial court within the week. You know how that goes. You'll sit in a cell in Harlow City while proceedings drag out, and while you're sitting there, this ranch operates without its owner. Debts accumulate. Maintenance slips. Hands find other employment." He paused. "Or, the judge is prepared to offer a fair price for the property. He had an assessment done last fall, and you and your family walk away with enough to start over somewhere with fewer complications. Those are the two options," Cole said. It wasn't a question. Those are the two options that end quietly. Greer's eyes moved briefly to Evelyn. "The judge is aware you've recently taken on additional responsibilities. He's accounting for that in his generosity." Evelyn said, "How did Margaret Mercer die?" Greer went very still, just for a moment, a fraction of a second, and then he was composed again, but she'd seen it. "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said. "You knew her, though. You've been coming to this ranch for years, making offers on behalf of Cobb. You knew her." "Mrs. Mercer, Harper," she said. "My name is Harper." Something moved across Greer's face that she couldn't entirely identify. Not guilt. She didn't think a man like Greer had much left of that, but something adjacent to it, some vestigial awareness of a line that had been crossed and what it had cost. "Tell the judge no," Cole said. "Same as before. Same as it'll be next time." Greer looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke again, the performance of reasonableness was gone from his voice. What was underneath it was flat and certain. "You're making a mistake that can't be walked back." "Probably," Cole said. "Go on, Greer." Greer turned his horse and rode back to the fence line. Cole stood on the porch until he was gone. Then he said very quietly, "We've got maybe until nightfall. After that, Cobb stops asking." Evelyn calculated it. Luke had been riding for 9 or 10 hours. The pass was rough, but a good horse on a known trail, Pete's trail markers memorized, the oilcloth sealed against weather, could cover 40 miles in 12 to 14 hours in winter conditions, if nothing went wrong. If nothing went wrong. "Then we hold until nightfall," she said. The holding was the hardest thing. Pete and Cal and Dixon took positions at the fence corners without being asked, which said something about what kind of men they were. Pete had an old rifle he clearly knew how to use. Cal was younger and less certain about what he was prepared to do, and Evelyn saw him looking at Pete periodically in the way people look at someone more experienced when they're waiting to find out what courage looks like in practice. Evelyn brought them coffee at noon. She didn't do it to be domestic. She did it because a person with something in their hands is a person who feels slightly less like they're waiting to fall. Dixon, the youngest of the three hands, accepted the cup and said, "How long you been married to Cole?" "We're not married yet," she said. He blinked. "I thought, it's been 7 weeks. We haven't had much time for ceremony." He absorbed this. "Does that change anything, legally?" "I don't intend to find out," she said. She went back to the house. The afternoon brought clouds down from the north, thick and gray, the kind that carried snow and intention. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees and the wind came with it. Evelyn stood at the window and looked at the mountains and thought about what 10 degrees and new snow meant on a high-altitude pass, and then she stopped thinking about it because there was nothing useful in it. Daniel came to stand beside her. He had his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the mountains the same way she had hers. "He's okay," Daniel said. "I know. He's better on a horse than anyone I've ever seen. You know that." "I know that. He's also the most careful person I've ever seen, and I grew up with him, so that's saying something." Daniel paused. "He doesn't take risks he can't calculate." Evelyn looked at her second son, at the boy who had been quietly, steadily bearing the weight of not being the oldest for the past several months, doing everything Luke would have done if Luke were there, and receiving none of the particular acknowledgement that the oldest gets simply by being first. "You're right," she said. "He doesn't." "So," Daniel shrugged, the particular shrug of a 13-year-old who is feeling more than he'll say. He's okay. He's okay, she said. She believed it and she didn't believe it, the way you believe things when the believing is load-bearing. At 3 in the afternoon, one of Cobb's men tried the east fence. He didn't try to breach it, not directly. He rode along the fence line slowly, studying it, looking at the posts and the spacing and the sight lines with professional attention. And Dixon, who was stationed there, watched him do it with his rifle across his knees and the cold settling into his hands. Cole came out and stood where he could be seen. He didn't reach for his rifle. He just stood there, in the open, and the man on the other side of the fence looked at him and after a moment rode back toward the tree line. He was counting us, Pete said when Cole came back, trying to figure how many we are. How many are they? I make it 9 now. There's a rider that came in from the north around noon I didn't see at first. 9 men against 3 hands, and Cole and... Evelyn didn't count herself out of the arithmetic, but she was realistic about what she added to it. She could fire a rifle adequately. She was not a marksman. They won't move before dark, Cole said. He said it with the certainty of someone who had thought it through rather than someone who was hoping. Moving in daylight against a defended property. That's not a legal warrant anymore. That's armed assault. Cobb needs the legal veneer. He'll want darkness. And after dark? Pete asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. After dark, we keep lights visible inside the house. Make it look normal. Keep the children calm. And we hope. Pete nodded. He didn't ask what they were hoping for. He already knew. The light began to go at 4:30. Evelyn put supper on the table and the children ate, and she watched their faces in the lamplight and tried to memorize them. Not out of despair, but out of the instinct that certain moments deserve to be held carefully. That later, you might need to remember the particular way May held her spoon, or the way Henry talked with his mouth full, regardless of how many times she'd told him not to, or the way Clara cut her bread into exact halves before she ate it. These ordinary things. These things that were the actual content of a life. Cole sat at the table and ate, which she respected. He could have paced. He could have communicated his worry through every movement the way worried men often did, infecting the room with it. Instead, he ate, and when Henry said something about the fence riders, he said, calmly and without drama, "I'm working on it." And Henry accepted that and went back to his bread. After supper, the younger children went upstairs. Clara took them in the quiet, efficient way Clara did things, without being asked and without announcing she was doing it. Evelyn heard her reading to them, the same story she'd been telling during the worst moments of the past few days, something about a girl who turned into a river, a story Clara had apparently invented entire, which Evelyn hadn't known she could do. Daniel and Luke's empty chair sat at the table. Evelyn looked at it once and then looked away. It was Pete who heard them first. He came to the back door at 7 in the evening, knocked his signal, and when Cole opened it, he said, "Horses on the main road, more than before, and they're coming from the north." North? Evelyn was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. Could be Cobb sending reinforcements, Cole said. He was already moving to the front window. Could be, Pete said. But his voice had a different quality than it had had all day. Something that wasn't quite certainty but was in the same neighborhood. The horses came out of the dark at the end of the road in a group of 7 or 8, moving at a canter, and the first thing Evelyn saw was that they were carrying lamps. Not the concealed movement of men trying to approach unseen. Lamps, lit, swinging with the horses' motion. And in front of them, on a horse she recognized, Prophet, their own roan, a figure that was too young and too familiar, and had the particular seat of a boy who'd grown up with animals. She was out the door before Cole had fully processed what he was seeing. Luke pulled Prophet up at the yard fence, and he looked terrible, windburned and exhausted and listing slightly in the saddle in a way that meant he'd been riding for close to 18 hours, and his body was informing him of that fact. But he was there, intact, on a horse that was blowing hard and stumbling slightly with fatigue. Behind him, the riders with lamps were pulling up, and they were not Cobb's men. They wore federal badges, and they carried themselves with the particular authority of people who have traveled a long way quickly for a specific purpose. "Mama?" Luke said. His voice was rough and stripped of everything except the fact of the word itself. Evelyn reached him and put her hand on his leg, the closest she could reach, and felt that he was shaking. Not obviously. The small involuntary shaking of a body that had been held together by will for too long and was now standing down. "You're here," she said. "I'm here." He looked at the riders behind him. "This is Marshal Brace." A man on a bay horse moved forward into the lamplight. He was perhaps 55, with a gray mustache and the steady, unhurried eyes of someone who had seen enough that very little surprised him. He looked at Evelyn and then at Cole, who had come out of the house behind her. "Cole Mercer?" he said. "That's right. William Brace, Federal Marshal, Millhaven District." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Your boy brought me a letter from your late wife, addressed to me personally 3 years ago." He looked at Cole steadily. "I'm sorry I didn't get it sooner." Cole took the paper and looked at it. Margaret's handwriting, her name at the bottom. And something moved through his face that was private and too large for the moment, and that he put away quickly. "She found what she needed to find," he said. "She did," Brace said, "and your boy told us the rest on the ride here." He turned his horse and looked at the fence line, at the darkness where Cobb's men were. "How many?" 9, last count, Cole said. "They were planning to move after dark." "They may still plan to." Brace looked at his riders. "Let's introduce ourselves." What happened next was not a battle. That was the strange thing. After all the waiting and the cold and the weight of the day, what happened was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. Federal marshals in sufficient numbers have a specific effect on men who have been operating behind the protection of local corruption. They remove the protection, and without it, what remains is just men in a cold field who suddenly have to calculate their own risk without a judge's seal to hide behind. Greer tried to run. He made it to the east fence and was cut off by 2 of Brace's riders and taken from his horse with minimal ceremony. He went quietly, which told Evelyn something about the kind of man he was. Dangerous when insulated, diminished when exposed. The others surrendered their weapons with varying degrees of resistance. One of the younger men, a boy, really, maybe 17, started crying when the cuffs went on, and Evelyn watched that and felt something complicated that wasn't quite pity, but lived near it. By 9 o'clock, Cobb's men were secured and Brace's riders were warming themselves in the bunkhouse, and Evelyn was back in the kitchen. Luke was sitting at the table with his boots still on and his coat still on, and a bowl of cold leftover supper in front of him that he was eating with the mechanical focus of someone too tired to taste anything. She sat down across from him. "You did it boring and careful?" she said. He looked up, the ghost of something that might eventually become a smile. "Mostly." "What does mostly mean?" "There was a section of trail above the tree line where the wind was. It was bad. I went slower than I should have, maybe. Made up time on the descent." He ate another spoonful. "The horse did most of it. Prophet knows a good trail." "You named him right," she said. He looked at her. "Is everyone okay?" "Everyone is fine. Everyone is upstairs, and 2 of them are asleep." He nodded and ate, and she watched him and felt the particular exhaustion of fear that has resolved, not peace exactly, not yet, but the loosening of something that had been held too tight for too many hours. Cole came in from the yard and poured himself water and stood at the counter and looked at Luke with the expression of a man who has something to say and is figuring out how to say it with the right weight and not more than the right weight. "Pete told me you asked him about the trail markers 3 days ago," Cole said. "Before any of this." Luke looked at him. "I thought we might need them." "You were right." Cole drank his water, set the cup down. "Your mother's got good judgment. Seems like it runs." Luke looked at his bowl. Something in his face shifted. Not acceptance exactly, the beginning of the geography of it, the first adjustment of a longer reckoning. "My father had good judgment too," he said. Not as a challenge, just as a fact he needed said. "I know he did," Cole said. "She told me." The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove burned its steady, indifferent burn. "I'm going to sleep," Luke said. He stood up, still in his coat. I can't be useful for anything right now." "You've been useful enough," Evelyn said. He went upstairs. Cole sat with Brace at the kitchen table after the children were all asleep, and Evelyn stayed because it was her kitchen and her family and her right, and Brace didn't seem to object. The papers were on the table, Margaret's list, the deed copies, the letter. Brace had read them all twice. "The county office in Harlow City," Brace said. "This Dalby, is he still there?" Far as I know, Cole said. We'll go in the morning. I want to secure those records before anyone has the chance to move them. He looked at the papers. This is meticulous work. Your wife understood what she was looking at. She was... Yes, Cole said. She understood things carefully. The forgeries on the deed transfers, if they match what's in the county books, that's federal fraud. Land values on that scale. We're talking about something Cobb's been running for a decade at minimum. Brace sat back. He'll be arrested on our warrant, not his. The territorial appointment doesn't protect him from federal charges. Where is he now? Evelyn asked. Harlow City? His courthouse. Brace looked at her. We'll go to him tomorrow before he hears what happened here tonight. He won't hear until morning at the earliest. None of his men are in a position to send word. He'll run, Cole said. Maybe. Brace said it without particular worry. Men like Cobb usually think they're too established to run. They've been the ones doing the pursuing for so long they forget they can become the pursued. He folded Margaret's letter carefully and set it apart from the others. I'll need to keep this as evidence. Keep it, Cole said. He looked at it for a moment. She should have sent it. She would have, Brace said. She was building a case. She was being careful. I told her to stop. Brace looked at him, not with judgment, just with the steady look of a man who has heard many things and learned to receive them without performing a reaction. You didn't know what she'd found. No, Cole said. I didn't ask. The fire settled in the stove. Outside, the wind had died and the night was very still, the kind of still that comes after weather and feels temporary, like the world holding its breath. Evelyn picked up Margaret's list, the one in the dried inkwell, the first thing she'd found, and looked at it one more time. The neat handwriting, the 5 names, the notation about Cobb at the bottom. She thought about a woman she'd never met, in a house she now lived in, doing careful work in a cold room while the man she loved told her to leave it alone and the people outside were already watching. Doing it anyway. Hiding it in an inkwell where the right person, eventually, might find it. She set the paper back on the table. She left this for someone, Evelyn said. She knew she might not get to use it herself, so she left it where it could be found. Brace looked at the paper. Looks that way. She trusted that someone would find it and know what it was. Nobody answered because it didn't need an answer. It was just true, and they sat with it in the lamplight. This woman's careful act persisting 3 years past her death, carrying its weight all this way to a kitchen table where strangers read it and understood what she'd meant. Outside, the night was still. Brace's riders were in the bunkhouse. Cobb's men were secured in the barn under watch. Somewhere in the mountains, the trail Luke had ridden was empty now, dark, the hoofprints filling slowly with the light snow that had started falling again. Tomorrow would bring its own difficulties. Harlow City and Dalby and the county records and Cobb and his courthouse, all of that was real and coming and not simple. But tonight, for the first time since she'd pulled up in front of Red Hollow's silent main street, Evelyn Harper sat in a kitchen that felt like something that belonged to her, with her children asleep above her and the evidence on the table and a federal marshal who had ridden through the night, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, the specific and particular relief of a thing that has been headed toward catastrophe and has instead, against the odds and through the effort of people trying their hardest, turned another way. She got up and put the kettle on. "Coffee," she said, "before you sleep." Brace said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harper." She didn't correct him this time. Brace left before dawn with 4 of his riders, and Cole went with them. Evelyn had not argued about that. She'd wanted to. There was a version of herself that would have stood in the kitchen doorway and listed the reasons he should stay, the children, the ranch, the uncertainty of what waited in Harlow City. But she'd looked at his face and understood that this was something he needed to be present for. Not out of vengeance, out of the particular human requirement of witnessing. Cole had spent 3 years living inside a verdict the town had reached without evidence, and the undoing of that verdict was not something he could afford to receive secondhand. She'd handed him his coat and said, "Come back in one piece." He'd looked at her for a moment with that contained, careful look he had, and said, "I'll do my best," which was not a promise, and they both knew it, and she respected him more for not making it one. Luke was still asleep when they rode out. She let him sleep. The ride to Harlow City took 3 hours in the early morning cold, and Cobb was still in the courthouse when they arrived. That was the first thing that surprised Cole. He'd expected the man to have run, or at least to have heard something, some fragment of the night's events carried ahead of them by instinct or informant. But Harlan Cobb was in his office on the second floor of the territorial courthouse, sitting behind a large oak desk with papers in front of him when Brace's men came through the door. He looked up with the expression of a man who had been interrupted at legitimate work, and for a fraction of a second Cole saw the performance of it, the practiced normalcy, the judge's face that decades of authority had made nearly automatic. Then Cobb saw Cole behind Brace, and the performance dropped. It didn't drop into guilt. That would have been simpler. It dropped into calculation. The rapid, cold reassessment of a man who has built his life on controlling outcomes and is now measuring very quickly how much control he has left. "Marshal Brace," Cobb said. His voice was steady. "This is unexpected. Judge Cobb." Brace set a folded document on the desk. "Federal warrant for your arrest. Land fraud, forgery of legal documents, conspiracy to deprive citizens of property rights under federal statute. There are additional charges pending investigation." Cobb looked at the warrant without touching it. "On what evidence?" "Documents recovered from the Mercer Ranch, corroborated by the county deed records your man Dalby has been maintaining." Brace paused. "Dalby is in custody. He spoke to us this morning before we came here, at some length." Something moved through Cobb's face at Dalby's name. Not surprise. The surprise was already gone. But the rapid calculation of how much Dalby knew and how much he would say, and the conclusion of that calculation was visible in the slight tightening around his eyes. Cole had told himself, on the ride here, that he would let Brace handle it, that he would stand back and be a witness and not do anything that gave Cobb's attorneys something to work with later. He'd meant it when he told himself. "My wife," Cole said. He hadn't planned the words. They came because they were there, because they'd been there for 3 years. "Margaret, did you send someone to the ranch that night, or did Greer go on his own initiative?" Cobb looked at him. The calculation was still running behind his eyes, and Cole watched it arrive at a conclusion. That the evidence was already assembled, that Dalby had already spoken, that the particular story of Margaret Mercer was either going to come out in court or come out here, and that one of those options offered more control than the other. "Greer went on his own initiative," Cobb said. "I want that understood. What happened to your wife was not—" He stopped. "Greer told me afterward. I want that on the record." "What did he tell you?" Brace said. His voice had the quality of someone asking a question they already know the answer to but need stated aloud. "That he'd spoken with her." Cobb's hands were flat on the desk. "That she'd confronted him at the ranch. That there was an altercation on the upper landing." He paused. "He told me it was an accident." The room was very quiet. Cole stood with the information and felt it settle. Not like relief, not like resolution, more like the final placement of a weight that had been suspended for 3 years. It didn't make him feel better. It made him feel the specific and particular grief of a thing confirmed. Margaret had known, and she'd been brave enough to confront it directly. And it had killed her. And he hadn't been in that room. And he would never have been in that room because she hadn't told him. And she hadn't told him because he'd told her to stop. All of that was still true. Cobb's confession didn't change any of it. It just gave it a shape. "That's enough," Brace said to Cobb. "Stand up." Cobb stood up slowly, with the dignity of a man who has decided that dignity is the last thing he controls. He looked at Cole one more time. "The ranch will stand," he said. "I want you to know I understand that. What I built here, it's already done regardless." "That's not for you to decide anymore," Cole said. Brace put the cuffs on Cobb himself, and they walked him out of the courthouse into the cold morning street of Harlow City, and people came out of shops and offices and stopped on the boardwalk to watch. And the watching had its own quality. Not triumph, not satisfaction, something more complicated than either. A long-held breath released. The county office was 3 buildings down. Brace's other riders had secured Dalby an hour earlier, and the deed records, the actual ledgers, the ones Margaret had copied by hand in that cold room at the ranch, were sealed and cataloged under federal authority before noon. Cole stood in the county office and looked at the ledger open on page 114, the page Margaret had noted in the inkwell list, and he looked at the entry for Aldous Vickers and the signature beside it, and he could see what she'd seen, the handwriting that didn't match the hand in the 1881 records. The slight, careful alterations that would be invisible unless you were looking for them and knew what real looked like. She'd seen it. She'd been meticulous, and she'd been right, and she had trusted. Even when she hid the papers, even when she wrote a letter she couldn't yet send, she had trusted that the truth was worth preserving regardless of whether she got to see it used. He closed the ledger. One of Brace's men found him by the window a few minutes later and said the judge was secured and they'd be transporting to federal holding in the morning, and Cole said thank you and meant it as something more than a courtesy. He rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, alone. Evelyn heard the horse in the yard and was at the door before Cole had dismounted. She read his face in the way she'd gotten used to reading it over the past weeks. The contained exterior, the thing underneath it, and she could see both the resolution and the cost of it. Cobb, she said. Federal custody. He tied the horse. He confirmed Greer killed Margaret, called it an accident. It wasn't. She waited. Dalby is talking. The land records are sealed. It'll go to federal court. Could take months, maybe longer. But it'll go. He came up the steps. It's not over exactly, but the part where they can come at this ranch is over. She stepped back to let him in. He came into the kitchen and stood there for a moment, and she thought he might say something else about Margaret or Cobb or the ledger, but he didn't. He just stood in the kitchen of his own house in the afternoon and looked around it, at the evidence of 9 children distributed throughout the space, the mended socks drying by the stove, the drawing Henry had done on a scrap of paper and left on the table, the general organized disorder of a house that was actually lived in, and something went out of his face that had been there since she'd known him. Not sadness, exactly. More like the thing you carry when you've been braced for a long time, the posture of permanent defense. It went out of him like air. Sit down, she said. I'll heat the coffee. He sat down. May appeared from the front room, assessed the situation with 4-year-old accuracy, and climbed into the chair beside him without asking. He looked at her. You're back, May said. I'm back. Was it scary? He thought about it. Some of it. May nodded, satisfied with the honesty of this. I was a little scared too, she said. But Clara told us a story about a river girl, so then I wasn't as scared. That helped? Yes. She picked up the drawing Henry had left on the table and studied it. This is supposed to be a horse, but it doesn't look like one. No, Cole said. It doesn't. Evelyn put the coffee on the stove and listened to her 4-year-old hold a conversation with a man who, 2 months ago, had been a stranger who'd seen her put back a tin of condensed milk. And she thought, this is what a life is made of. Not the dramatic moments. Those are the architecture, the load-bearing structure. But the 10,000 small and ordinary things that fill the space inside the architecture. The things that are easy to miss when you're busy surviving. Well, the weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing real is simple, but they had a different quality than the weeks before. The men whose land Cobb had taken, or pressured away, began to appear. Not all of them, not at once, but in a slow trickle as word spread through the valley that the federal investigation was real and moving. Some came to the ranch directly, older men mostly, with the specific weathering of people who'd been carrying a wrong for years and had learned to carry it quietly. A man named Garrett Tennant came on a Tuesday in late February, the son of the family whose water had been fouled, grown now, with a wife and 2 children who waited in a wagon at the road while he came up to the house alone. He stood on the porch and looked at Cole with an expression that was working through several things simultaneously. I heard what happened, Garrett said. I know. My father sold because he had no choice. Cobb's attorney told him the legal costs to fight it would bankrupt us regardless of the outcome. He paused. I was 14. I know, Cole said again. He said it without defensiveness, without the performance of guilt either, just acknowledgement. The federal investigation, they're saying the forced sales might be reversible, that we might have a claim. Brace told me the same. You should talk to him directly. He's got a man in Harlow City handling the property claims. Cole paused. For what it's worth, the lower creek that feeds your old pasture. Nobody's been using it since your family left. If the land comes back to you, the water's there. Garrett Tennant stood on the porch for a moment and looked at the mountains. Whatever he was feeling was too large and too complicated to name, and he didn't try to name it. Thank you, he said, and went back to his wagon. Cole stood on the porch and watched them go, and Evelyn, watching from the window, thought, "This is what it looks like when someone decides who they are going to be with the time they have left." There was no ceremony in it. That was the thing people didn't understand about decency. It didn't come with ceremony. It just showed up on a porch on a Tuesday and said the thing and meant it. But Luke recovered from the ride in about a week, which he would have disagreed with since he'd claimed to be fine the morning after. But Evelyn could tell from the way he moved and the duration of his sleep and the amount he ate that his body was working through something significant. She let him pretend he was fine. She kept feeding him. He and Cole arrived at something during that period that she couldn't have precisely named. Not friendship. That was too easy a word for it and implied a kind of equivalence that wasn't there yet. More like a mutual understanding of where the other person stood, and a decision to respect the standing without requiring it to be something else. She found them in the barn one afternoon, Cole teaching Luke a particular way of wrapping a horse's leg that prevented an injury the animal was prone to, Luke watching with the careful attention he gave to practical things. Neither of them was talking. They were just doing a task together, and the silence between them was the workable kind. She went back to the house. Daniel, who had his own complicated feelings about Cole that were less resolved than Luke's, came around more slowly and in his own way, which involved asking Cole approximately one practical question per day about the land, the cattle, the equipment, and receiving answers without comment, and then going away and thinking about those answers and apparently finding them acceptable, because the next day he'd ask another one. It was the most Daniel way possible of arriving somewhere, and Evelyn loved him for it. The younger children had fewer complications. They adapted to the ranch the way children adapt to geography, by exploring it, by making it theirs, by finding the specific corners and outbuildings and fence posts that became particular to their experience of it. Henry named 3 of the cattle. May decided that the barn cat, who had no interest in being socialized, was nonetheless her personal property, and pursued a campaign of patient friendship that the cat was slowly losing. Clara one morning told Evelyn that she liked it here. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, the way Clara said true things. "It feels like we could stay," she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I think we could." They married in March, on a Thursday morning, because a Wednesday had seemed to Evelyn too early in the week, and a Friday too close to the weekend, and Thursday had no particular symbolism attached to it, which was what she wanted. No symbolism, just the practical fact of a decision made legally formal. Ruth Caswell came from town because Evelyn had gone to see her the week before and had told her what had happened and what had been found, and Ruth had listened with the particular quality of someone receiving information they'd been waiting years for. When Evelyn finished, Ruth had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "I always thought Margaret was worth more than what happened to her." And Evelyn had said, "She was. She still is." And something had settled between them that was the beginning of a friendship. So Ruth came, and Pete and Cal and Dixon came, and Garrett Tennant came back with his wife, which surprised Evelyn and moved her more than she expected. It was not a large ceremony. Cole had polished his boots. Evelyn wore the best dress she'd brought from Billings, which was not very impressive but was clean and pressed and had a small collar she liked. Luke stood beside her and didn't look at Cole throughout the short, formal words, which was honest if not generous, but at the end, when it was done, he shook Cole's hand. A real handshake, not a performance of one, and said, "You take care of her." With the directness of someone who means a thing entirely, Cole looked at him and said, "That's a 2-way arrangement." Luke thought about that, nodded once, let go of his hand. May cried because May had decided beforehand that this was the kind of occasion that required tears and had committed to it fully, and Henry ate 3 pieces of the cake Ruth had brought, and Daniel stood near the window and watched everything with his careful, evaluating eyes, and at the end of it, came to Evelyn and hugged her without preamble and went back to the window. That was enough. That was more than enough. The federal case against Harlan Cobb took 14 months to move through the courts, which was faster than Brace had predicted and slower than everyone had hoped. When the verdict came, guilty on 11 counts including fraud, conspiracy, and accessory to the death of Margaret Mercer, Evelyn was feeding chickens in the yard, and Cole brought the letter from Brace out to her. She read it standing in the yard with feathers on her coat and the late spring sun on her face. 11 counts, she said. 11, Cole said. She handed the letter back. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to, maybe. Expected some clean release of the thing that had been gathered and held since she'd first spread that list on the kitchen table. What she felt instead was something quieter and less resolved, the recognition that verdicts don't undo. Margaret was still dead. The tenants had gotten their land back through the federal restitution process, but they hadn't gotten back the years of it. The decades spent somewhere else, while their father aged without his own ground under him. The Vickers family, one of the names on the list, had moved to Oregon and couldn't be found. Justice, she understood now, was not the same as repair. It was smaller than repair and more difficult. And it was still worth doing, still worth all of it. But it didn't fix what was broken. It just stopped the breaking. She would have wanted to see it, Cole said. Yes, Evelyn said. She would have. He looked at the mountains. The snow on the peaks was thinner now, retreating with the season. By June, they'd be mostly clear. I put flowers on her grave last week, he said. It came out without particular emphasis, just a fact. First time since the second year. I didn't know how to do it without it feeling. I didn't know how to do it right. Evelyn looked at him. Did it feel right this time? He thought about it. More right than wrong. That's usually how it goes, she said. She went back to the chickens. He went back to whatever he'd been doing in the barn. And the ordinary afternoon continued around them. Luke's voice somewhere near the north fence. The sound of Henry arguing with May about something that mattered enormously to both of them. The smell of the creek and the pine coming down from the mountains on the wind. Shut up. There are people who will tell you that the frontier was about courage. They'll tell you it was about strength, about the capacity to endure, about something essentially heroic in the human spirit that expresses itself when everything is stripped away and there's nothing left but the bare choice between surrender and persistence. That's not wrong, exactly. But it's not the whole picture. What Evelyn Harper understood in the years that followed, and there were years, good ones mostly, with the ordinary proportion of hardship and surprise and joy that years tend to contain, was that the harder thing was not the enduring. The harder thing was the opening, allowing yourself to arrive somewhere new without knowing whether it would hold you. Saying yes to Cole Mercer in a parking lot, which she still privately called it, because Cole still privately winced when she did. Walking her children into a town that went silent. Finding a dead woman's list in an inkwell and deciding that it mattered enough to act on. Not because she was fearless. She was afraid for most of it, in the practical, ongoing way of someone who understands the actual odds. But fear, she'd come to believe, was not the opposite of courage. It was the material courage was made from. You couldn't have one without the other. And anyone who told you they'd walked through something hard without being afraid was either lying or hadn't been paying attention. Her children grew. That was the simple version of it, and it was also the true version. Luke grew into someone who managed the north section of the ranch with a competence that Cole acknowledged directly and without reservation, which was how Cole acknowledged everything, directly and without excess. Daniel became a surveyor, which surprised everyone, including Daniel, and spent his 20s mapping territorial land claims with the precision that had always been native to him and was now, finally, useful in the way he'd always wanted his precision to be useful. Clara went to a teacher's college in Helena and came back 3 years later and taught in Red Hollow for the rest of her working life, which was the most Clara outcome possible, and which Evelyn had known was coming long before Clara did. The younger ones scattered and returned and scattered again, in the way that children do when they've grown up somewhere that felt enough like home to leave and come back to alternately. Henry, predictably, became a person about whom many stories were told at family gatherings. May, less predictably, became a veterinarian, which nobody had seen coming except possibly the barn cat, who had eventually, after 3 years of patient pursuit, allowed her to sit beside him. Cole and Evelyn had 23 years together before he died. His heart, in his sleep, in their bed, on a January morning that was, by some accident of weather, warm and clear, and nothing like the winter she'd arrived in. She'd woken beside him and known immediately, and she'd lain there for a little while in the warmth of the morning, and then she'd gotten up and dressed and gone to tell Luke, who came over from his house on the north section, and sat with her in the kitchen, while the news moved through the valley in the particular way that the death of a known and respected man moves, gathering people in quiet. She missed him with the specific, unglamorous heaviness of missing a person who had been the furniture of your life for a long time. The people you stop noticing because they're always there, and then they're not. And the absence has dimensions you couldn't have mapped beforehand. She stayed on the ranch for another 11 years after that, until her knees made the argument she couldn't refute, and then she went to live in Clara's house in Red Hollow and sat on that porch in the summers and watched the valley she'd driven into in a wagon with 9 children and $4. And she thought about the woman who had hidden a list in an inkwell and trusted that someone would find it and understand what it meant. She thought about Margaret often, in the way you think about someone you never met but owe something to. The debt was real and couldn't be paid, and Evelyn didn't try to pay it. She just carried it with respect, the way Margaret had carried everything, carefully, without waiting for the world to make it easier. The ranch was still there when Evelyn died. Luke's family ran it. His daughter, a girl with her great-grandmother Evelyn's stubbornness and her great-grandfather Thomas's eyes, and her own particular quality that was neither of them, was the one who found the old survey map in the storage room years later when they were cleaning out some boxes, and asked Luke what it was. Luke looked at it for a long time. "That's the map that tells you who owned what," he said, "and who tried to take it, and who stopped them." His daughter looked at the map, at the property lines, the creek, the names in faded ink. What happened to them? The people who tried to take it? "They lost," Luke said. "Not easily, but they lost." She turned the map over in her hands. "And the people who stopped them?" Luke looked out the storage room window at the valley. The snow on the peaks, the creek running bright in the afternoon light, the land his mother had chosen to stay on when staying was the harder and more uncertain choice. "They made something," he said, "out of what they had." It wasn't a heroic answer. It wasn't the kind of thing that gets carved into stone. But it was the true thing, which is rare and more durable than the heroic thing, and it was enough. It had always been enough. Viet lai part bon cho zai hơn nữa mười bonzo bon mười phút. The morning after Luke left was the longest morning of Evelyn's life, and she had lived through the morning she'd found Thomas in the barn. She kept herself moving because stillness was not something she could afford. She made breakfast for 8 children, distributed tasks, checked that the younger ones stayed away from the windows, and did all of it with the surface competence of someone whose hands knew what to do, even when the rest of her was somewhere on a mountain in the dark. Clara watched her throughout breakfast with the careful, measuring look that Clara had inherited from nobody. It was entirely her own, that look, something she'd developed early and refined into a kind of quiet precision, and didn't say anything, which meant Clara understood and was choosing to be useful rather than expressive. Henry asked once at the table where Luke was, and Daniel, 13, and recently understanding the weight of being the second oldest, said errand in a tone that closed the subject, and Henry, to his credit, let it close. Cole came in from the yard at 7:30, snow on his coat, jaw set, eyes telling her what he was working not to say out loud. "They've moved up," he said when the children were occupied. "South fence and east now. Greer's with them. And there's a man I don't recognize on a horse at the main road junction who isn't one of Cobb's usual people. He's watching the road north." North, the direction of the mountain pass. "Could they know?" she asked. "Greer's careful. He might have guessed we'd try to get word out." Cole poured himself coffee without sitting down. "If they know Luke's on that trail." He left before midnight. He had hours before they moved up. "I know." He drank. "I know." But knowing a thing and being settled by it were different, and neither of them pretended otherwise. She watched him stand at the counter with his coffee, and she thought about what it cost a man like Cole to wait. He was not a waiting kind of man. She'd understood that quickly enough in their weeks together, the way he solved problems by moving toward them, by putting himself between the problem and whatever it threatened. Standing at a fence line while men watched from the tree line, and a boy he barely knew rode through a mountain pass alone. That was its own particular kind of suffering, and he bore it without complaint, which almost made it worse to watch. "Pete counted right," she said. 9 men? 9 that we can see. Could be more positioned further out that he hasn't spotted. And if they move on the house, they won't in daylight. He set the cup down. Cobb's too careful for that. He needs this to look like a legal action, not an armed seizure. The warrant gives him cover only if there's some pretense of due process. He looked at the window. "After dark is different." "Then we have until dark." "Yes." She nodded once. That was something. 12 hours was something you could work with, something you could divide into tasks and fill with action and get through to the other side of. And that was how she'd been living for the past year. One 12-hour block at a time, one problem at a time, one morning at a time. It was not a dignified way to live, but it was an effective one. "I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about Greer," she said. "Not what he's done for Cobb, who he is, where he came from, whether he has anyone he answers to besides Cobb." Cole looked at her. "Why?" "Because if this comes down to a negotiation before it comes down to something worse, I want to know what I'm working with." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him deciding whether to argue the point, whether to tell her that it wouldn't come to negotiation, that they just needed to hold until Luke returned. But he was too honest for that, and too practical, and he understood the same thing she did, that they had a handful of ranch hands against 9 armed men in the pretense of legal authority, and the math did not favor a sustained standoff. So he told her what he knew about Greer, which was more than she'd expected. Greer had come to the territory 6 years ago from somewhere in Wyoming, had found work as Cobb's enforcer through an attorney connection, had no family anyone in Red Hollow knew about, and had, according to Pete, a reputation for being thorough rather than cruel. A man who did what was required and no more, which in some ways was more frightening than cruelty, because it meant he was not susceptible to the satisfactions that made cruel men predictable. "He's not going to lose his head," Cole said, "whatever happens." "No," Evelyn agreed, "but he might lose his certainty." Greer came to the yard fence at 10 in the morning, alone this time, without the theatrical presence of armed riders. Just him on his dark horse, and his too clean coat, and the particular confidence of a man who believed the arithmetic was already solved. Cole went to the porch. Evelyn came with him. She'd made a decision about that after the last visit, and she wasn't revisiting it. Greer looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite surprise. He'd recalculated her, she could tell. She had the feeling she'd been a minor consideration in his planning up until now, a variable that complicated the situation slightly without changing its outcome, and she wanted him to keep thinking that for as long as possible. "Mercer," Greer said, "I'm going to be plain with you, because I think you're a man who respects plainness." "Go ahead," Cole said. "The warrant stands. Judge Cobb is prepared to bring the matter to territorial court within the week. You know how that goes. You'll sit in a cell in Harlow City while proceedings drag out, and while you're sitting there, this ranch operates without its owner. Debts accumulate, maintenance slips, hands find other employment." He paused. "Or, the judge is prepared to offer a fair price for the property. He had an assessment done last fall, and you and your family walk away with enough to start over somewhere with fewer complications." "Those are the two options," Cole said. It wasn't a question. "Those are the two options that end quietly." Greer's eyes moved briefly to Evelyn. "The judge is aware you've recently taken on additional responsibilities. He's accounting for that in his generosity." Evelyn said, "How did Margaret Mercer die?" Greer went very still. Just for a moment, a fraction of a second, and then he was composed again, but she'd seen it. She'd been watching for it specifically, watching for the place where the professional surface had a seam, and she'd found it. "I wouldn't know anything about that," he said. "You knew her, though. You've been coming to this ranch for years, making offers on behalf of Cobb. You knew her." "Mrs. Mercer, Harper," she said. "My name is Harper." Something moved across Greer's face that she couldn't entirely identify. Not guilt. She didn't think a man like Greer had much left of that, but something adjacent to it, some vestigial awareness of a line that had been crossed and what it had cost. He recovered quickly, but the recovery itself told her something. Men who had nothing to recover from didn't need to recover. "Tell the judge no," Cole said. "Same as before, same as it'll be next time." Greer looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke again, the performance of reasonableness was gone from his voice. What was underneath it was flat and certain. "You're making a mistake that can't be walked back." "Probably," Cole said. "Go on, Greer." Greer looked at the house one more time, at the window, at the children Evelyn knew were behind it, because she'd told them to stay back and children interpret. Stay back as stay close enough to see. And then he turned his horse and rode back toward the fence line without hurry. Cole stood on the porch until he was out of earshot. Then he said very quietly, "We've got maybe until nightfall. After that, Cobb stops asking." Evelyn calculated it. Luke had been riding for 9 or 10 hours. The pass was rough, but a good horse on a known trail, Pete's trail markers memorized, the oilcloth sealed against weather, could cover 40 miles in 12 to 14 hours in winter conditions, if nothing went wrong. If nothing went wrong. She'd been appending that clause to every thought since midnight, and it was wearing on her in a way she was working to conceal. Then we hold until nightfall, she said. The holding was the hardest thing. Pete and Cal and Dixon took positions at the fence corners without being asked, which said something about what kind of men they were. Pete had an old rifle he clearly knew how to use. Cal was younger and less certain about what he was prepared to do, and Evelyn saw him looking at Pete periodically in the way people look at someone more experienced when they're waiting to find out what courage looks like in practice. Dixon, the youngest, had gone very quiet in the way some young men go quiet when something real is happening. Not frozen, just internal, running some private calculation about themselves and what they were capable of. Evelyn brought them coffee at noon. She didn't do it to be domestic. She did it because a person with something in their hands is a person who feels slightly less like they're waiting to fall. And because walking the fence line herself gave her a legitimate reason to look at the tree line and count what she could count. She counted 8 men she could see clearly, and the suggestion of a 9th further back in the pines. Greer was not among the visible ones, which meant he was somewhere she couldn't see him, which was more unsettling than if he'd been standing at the fence in plain view. Dixon accepted the coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup and looked out at the tree line. "How long you think they'll wait?" he said. "Long enough to feel certain," she said. "Not longer." He nodded. He was maybe 22, 23. He had the look of someone who'd come west for reasons he hadn't fully articulated, even to himself, drawn by something that had seemed like freedom and turned out to be just a different set of walls. "I've got no stake in this ranch," he said. It wasn't a complaint, just a statement of fact he was examining. "No," she said. "You don't?" "Pete does. He's been here 4 years." Dixon looked at the cup in his hands. "I've been here 8 months. I know. I'm still here, though." She looked at him. "I noticed." He nodded again once and went back to watching the tree line, and she went back to the house. She found Daniel in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, writing something with the focused intensity he brought to everything he did. She looked over his shoulder. He was drawing the fence line from memory, the south and east sections, with the positions of the men he'd apparently been tracking from the upstairs windows. "You've been counting them," she said. "Someone should." She looked at the drawing. It was accurate, more accurate than she'd have expected from a 13-year-old working from a window at distance, with positions marked and a rough indication of their angles of observation. "This is good work," she said. He looked up. "There's a gap," he said. He pointed to the southeast corner where the south fence met the east. "Neither group has a clear sight line to that section. If someone needed to get out of the house without being seen from the main road—" "We're not running," she said. "I know. I'm just saying it's there." He set the pencil down. "I'm also saying that if Brace's men came up from the south, from Millhaven, they'd come through that gap before Greer's men could reposition." She looked at her 13-year-old son and felt the particular disorientation of a parent watching a child outgrow a version of themselves you were still carrying. She'd been thinking of Daniel as the second oldest, as the reliable one who managed the younger children, as the boy who asked practical questions about the ranch every day and then went away to think about the answers. She hadn't been thinking of him as someone who was also, quietly, making tactical assessments while she wasn't looking. "Your father would have done exactly this," she said. Daniel looked at the paper. Something moved through his face that he didn't quite manage to keep private. "I know," he said. "Pete told me about the gap yesterday. He said Cole knows about it too." "Pete talks to you?" "When I ask him things." A pause. "I ask him a lot of things." She put her hand on his shoulder briefly, not saying anything else, and then went to find Cole. Cole was in the front room with the survey map spread across the low table, cross-referencing something with the list of property transactions. He looked up when she came in. "Daniel's been tracking their positions," she said. "He's found a gap in their coverage at the southeast corner." Cole looked at her. Then he said, "He told you about that?" "You already knew. Pete mentioned it this morning." He looked back at the map. It's not wide enough to be useful in a confrontation. But if Brace comes from Millhaven, Daniel said the same thing. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's a sharp boy. Yes, she said. He is. She sat down across from him, and they went back to the map together, not because there was anything new to learn from it, but because having something specific to look at was better than looking at each other and acknowledging the thing neither of them could do anything about, which was the hour and the mountain and the boy on it. The afternoon brought clouds down from the north, thick and gray, the kind that carried snow and intention. The temperature dropped another 10 degrees and the wind came with it, and Evelyn stood at the window and looked at the mountains and thought about what 10 degrees and new snow meant on a high-altitude pass, and then she stopped thinking about it because there was nothing useful in it. The thinking didn't change the weather. The thinking didn't put a warmer coat on Luke or widen the trail or slow the wind. It just made her chest tighter, and she needed her chest to stay open and her breathing to stay even, so she stopped. Daniel came to stand beside her. He had his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the mountains the same way she had hers. He's okay, Daniel said. I know. He's better on a horse than anyone I've ever seen, you know that. I know that. He's also the most careful person I've ever seen, and I grew up with him, so that's saying something. Daniel paused. He doesn't take risks he can't calculate. Evelyn looked at her second son, at the boy who had been quietly, steadily bearing the weight of not being the oldest for the past several months, doing everything Luke would have done if Luke were there, and receiving none of the particular acknowledgement that the oldest gets simply by being first. You're right, she said. He doesn't. So, Daniel shrugged, the particular shrug of a 13-year-old who is feeling more than he'll say. He's okay. He's okay, she said. She believed it, and she didn't believe it, the way you believe things when the believing is load-bearing. You hold it not because you're certain, but because the alternative is to stop holding it, and you can't afford to stop. At 3 p.m, one of Cobb's men tried the east fence. He didn't try to breach it. Not directly. He rode along the fence line slowly, studying it, looking at the posts and the spacing and the sight lines with professional attention, and Dixon, who was stationed there, watched him do it with his rifle across his knees and the cold settling into his hands and his face showing nothing, which Evelyn thought was either training or a particular kind of stubbornness that sometimes looked like the same thing. Cole came out and stood where he could be seen. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, in the open, with his hands at his sides. And the man on the other side of the fence looked at him for a long moment, and then looked at Dixon, and then looked at the house, and after a moment rode back toward the tree line. He was counting us, Pete said, when Cole came back inside. Trying to figure how many we are. How many are they now? I make it 9, maybe 10. There's a rider that came in from the north around noon I didn't see at first. 9 or 10 men against 3 hands, and Cole and whatever Evelyn could add to it, which she was honest enough to know was not nothing but was not enough on its own. She'd been doing this arithmetic all day, and it kept coming out the same way. The only variable that could change the answer was 40 miles north on a mountain pass, and she had no information about that variable and no way to get any. They won't move before dark, Cole said. He said it with the certainty of someone who had thought it through rather than someone who was hoping. Moving in daylight against a defended property. That's not a legal warrant anymore. That's armed assault on a civilian homestead. Cobb needs the legal veneer. He'll want darkness. And after dark? Pete asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove settled behind him. From somewhere upstairs came the sound of May and Henry in a dispute that had the particular pitch of something that had been going on for a while and would continue without resolution. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. After dark, we keep lights visible inside the house, Cole said. We make it look normal. We keep the children calm. And we hold. Pete nodded. He didn't ask how long they held or what they held against or what holding meant when the numbers were what they were. He just nodded and went back to his post, and Cal followed him, and Dixon last, and Cole watched them go with the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was asking of people and the weight of that asking. The light began to go at 4:30. Evelyn put supper on the table and the children ate, and she watched their faces in the lamplight and tried to memorize them. Not out of despair, but out of the instinct that certain moments deserved to be held carefully, that later you might need to remember the particular way May held her spoon or the way Henry talked with his mouth full regardless of how many times she'd told him not to, or the way Clara cut her bread into exact halves before she ate it. These ordinary things. These things that were the actual content of a life, and that you didn't notice until you were in the kind of night that made you notice everything. Cole sat at the table and ate, which she respected. He could have paced. He could have communicated his worry through every movement the way worried men often did, infecting the room with it, making the children feel the weight of what the adults were carrying. Instead, he ate, and when Henry asked, with the directness of a 7-year-old who had decided the situation warranted a direct question, "Are those men going to hurt us?" Cole looked at him across the table and said, calmly and without drama, "Not if I can help it." And Henry looked at him for a moment with the evaluating look of a child deciding whether an adult answer is honest, and apparently decided it was, and went back to his food. After supper, the younger children went upstairs. Clara took them in the quiet, efficient way Clara did things. Without being asked and without announcing she was doing it, Evelyn heard her reading to them. The same story she'd been telling during the worst moments of the past few days. Something about a girl who turned into a river. A story Clara had apparently invented in tire cloth, which Evelyn hadn't known she could do and which made her feel, briefly and sharply, the particular pride of discovering something in your child that you hadn't known was there. Daniel stayed downstairs. He positioned himself in the front room with his drawing of the fence positions and updated it twice as the last light failed, adding annotations she could see from the doorway. He didn't ask permission, and she didn't withdraw it. He was doing useful work, and they both understood that. Luke's empty chair sat at the table. Evelyn looked at it once and then looked away. It was Pete who heard them first. He came to the back door at 7 in the evening and knocked his signal. 3 quick, 1 slow, and when Cole opened it, he said, "Horses on the main road, more than before, and they're coming from the north." North. Evelyn was on her feet before she'd consciously processed the word. "Could be Cobb sending reinforcements," Cole said. He was already moving to the front window, and his voice had the controlled quality of someone who was not allowing themselves to hope, because hope in the wrong direction was expensive. "Could be," Pete said. But something in his voice had shifted. Some quality that had been tight all day had loosened slightly, and he was clearly working not to let that loosening be premature. Evelyn pushed past Cole to the window. The horses came out of the dark at the end of the road in a group. 7, 8 of them, moving at a canter. And the first thing she registered was the lamps. Not the concealed, purposeful movement of men approaching under cover. Lamps, lit, swinging openly with the motion of the horses, the light of them bouncing across the snow in a way that was almost reckless in its visibility, almost like an announcement. And in front of them, on a horse she recognized even in the lamplight, even at that distance, even across the dark yard and the fence and the road, on Prophet, their roan, who moved in a way she knew her children's voices. A figure that was too young and too familiar, and had the particular seat of a boy who'd grown up with animals. She was out the door before she'd told herself to move. The cold hit her without her coat on, and she didn't care. She crossed the yard and reached the fence, and Luke pulled Prophet up on the other side, and he looked terrible. Wind-burned and exhausted and listing slightly in the saddle with the particular heaviness of someone whose body has been running on will for the last few hours and has started to present the bill. But he was there. He was whole. He was on the horse and looking at her with the eyes she'd been looking at since the day he was born. And her son was alive and in front of her, and it turned out that was the thing she'd been holding herself away from feeling all day. The full weight of it, because if she'd let herself feel it before she'd known the outcome, it would have unmade her. "Mama," he said. His voice was wrecked from the cold and the hours and the effort of it. Just the one word, but it had everything in it. She put her hand on his leg, the closest she could reach, and felt that he was shaking. Not obviously. The small, involuntary shaking of a body that has been held together by will and is now standing down from the effort of that holding. "You're here," she said. "I'm here." He looked at the riders behind him. "This is Marshal Brace." A man on a bay horse moved forward into the lamplight. He was perhaps 55, with a gray mustache and a broad, weathered face, and the steady, unhurried eyes of someone who has seen enough that very little surprises him. He looked at Evelyn and then at Cole, who had come out of the house and was standing at the yard fence. Cole Mercer? Brace said. That's right. William Brace, Federal Marshal, Millhaven District. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Your boy brought me a letter from your late wife, addressed to me personally, 3 years ago. He paused. I'm sorry I didn't get it sooner. Cole took the paper and looked at Margaret's handwriting on the outside, her name at the bottom. And something moved through his face that was private and too large for a public moment, and that he put away quickly, not because it didn't matter, but because this was not the time, and he knew how to decide that. She found what she needed to find, he said quietly. She did, Brace said. And your boy filled in the rest of it on the ride here. He looked around at the fence line, at the dark shapes of Cobb's men still visible at the tree line. How many? 9 or 10. They were planning to move after dark. They may still plan to. Brace turned to his riders. Let's introduce ourselves. What happened next was not a battle. That was the strange and slightly disorienting thing. After all the waiting and the cold and the accumulated weight of the day, what happened was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. Federal marshals in sufficient numbers carry a specific gravity that has less to do with their guns than with the thing their presence represents, the removal of protection. Cobb's men had been operating behind the shield of local authority, behind the seal of a territorial judge, behind warrants that looked legal, and a county office that supported the story. And the moment Brace's riders materialized on that road with federal badges, the shield was gone. What remained was just men in a cold field who had suddenly to calculate their personal risk without anyone else's authority to hide inside. Greer tried to run. He made it to the east fence before 2 of Brace's riders cut him off, and he came off his horse with minimal ceremony and into custody with the contained, careful manner of a man who had decided that resistance at this point was a cost without a benefit. He went quietly. She'd expected that once she thought about it. A man like Greer understood arithmetic. The others surrendered their weapons with varying degrees of resistance. One of the younger men, a boy really, maybe 17, started crying when the cuffs went on, in the sudden, helpless way of someone who had committed themselves to something without fully understanding what it was, and had now arrived at the understanding too late. Evelyn watched that and felt something complicated that wasn't quite pity, but lived in the same neighborhood as it. He'd been someone's son before he'd been Cobb's man. That didn't excuse anything. It was just also true. By 9 o'clock, Cobb's men were secured. Brace's riders were warming themselves in the bunkhouse. The yard was quiet for the first time in 2 days. Luke was sitting at the kitchen table with his boots still on and his coat still on, and a bowl of cold leftover supper in front of him that he was working through with the mechanical focus of someone too tired to taste anything, just processing fuel. Daniel was across from him, watching him eat with the look of a younger brother who has something to say and is deciding whether this is the moment to say it. It was not the moment, and Daniel, to his credit, seemed to understand that. Evelyn sat across from Luke and waited until he'd eaten half the bowl. You did it boring and careful? She said. He looked up. The ghost of something that might eventually become a smile moved across his wind-burned face. Mostly? What does mostly mean? There was a section above the tree line. The wind was... it was bad. I went slower than I should have for a while. He ate another spoonful. Made up time on the descent. Prophet is a better horse than his name suggests. Your father named him as a joke, she said. I know, Pete told me. He looked at the bowl. I found Marshal Brace at his office. He was still there, working late. When I gave him the letter, he paused. He recognized Margaret's handwriting. He said she'd sent him a note 3 years ago saying she might have something for him, and then he never heard from her again. He'd assumed she'd changed her mind. He looked up. He hadn't forgotten her. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. He read the documents, Luke continued, all of them. He asked me questions for about an hour. Then he got his men together, and we rode. He paused. He didn't hesitate. I want you to know that. I thought there might be... I didn't know if he'd believe it, or if he'd want more time, or... He believed it, she said. He believed Margaret's letter, Luke said. Everything else was just confirmation. Cole came in from outside and poured himself water and stood at the counter and looked at Luke for a moment with the expression of a man assembling something to say. Luke looked back at him without hostility. The hostility had been replaced by something less defined. Not warmth, not yet, but its precondition. The willingness to be in the same room without the air being loaded. Pete told me you asked him about the trail markers 3 days ago, Cole said, before any of this. I thought we might need them. You were right. Cole set down the water glass. You did something tonight that most men twice your age wouldn't do. Luke was quiet for a moment. I was scared the whole way. I know, Cole said. That's not the point. Luke looked at him. A long, assessing look. The kind that was working through several things at once. And then he looked at his bowl and ate another spoonful and said, My father would have done it better. Maybe, Cole said. But your father wasn't here. You were. It was not a sentimental thing to say. It was just a fact, delivered plainly, and that was exactly why it landed the way it did. Because it asked nothing of Luke, required no revision of his grief or his loyalties, simply acknowledged what was true. Luke looked at Cole once more, briefly, and then looked away. And the looking away was not dismissal. Evelyn got up and put the kettle on. Sleep, she told Luke. You can be useful tomorrow. He didn't argue. He stood up from the table, still in the coat, still in the boots, and went upstairs without stopping, and she heard the floorboard creak above her that was the one outside his room, and then quiet. She stood at the stove and waited for the kettle. Cole sat down at the table in the chair Luke had vacated and put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them. Daniel, who had been so quiet in the corner that she'd almost forgotten he was there, closed his drawing and tucked it under his arm and said, Good night, and went upstairs without being told, which she would remember. Brace wants to go to Harlow City in the morning, Cole said. I know. He wants me with him. She turned from the stove. Then go. You'd be here alone. Brace's men are in the bunkhouse. Pete is here, and Cobb's men are in federal custody. She looked at him. The danger was last night and tonight. Tomorrow is something else. He looked at the table. I need to see it, he said. Cobb, I need to be there. I know you do, she said. I'm not asking you not to go. He looked up at her. You're not what I expected, he said. It came out without ornamentation, the way he said everything. Neither are you, she said. The kettle began to sound. She turned back to it, and behind her she heard Cole lean back in his chair, and the kitchen held them both in its lamplight and its warmth, and outside the night was still and very cold, and the mountains stood where they'd always stood, indifferent and enormous, and somewhere in those mountains a trail was empty now that had carried everything. She poured the water. Coffee, she said, before Brace sleeps. He'll want it. Cole got up to help her carry it, and neither of them said anything else, and the saying nothing was its own kind of language, and they both understood it. Brace left before dawn with 4 of his riders, and Cole went with them. Evelyn had not argued about that. She'd looked at his face the night before and understood that this was something he needed to be present for. Not out of vengeance, out of the particular human requirement of witnessing. Cole had spent 3 years living inside a verdict the town had reached without evidence, and the undoing of that verdict was not something he could afford to receive secondhand. She'd handed him his coat and said, Come back in one piece. He'd said, I'll do my best. Not a promise. She respected him more for not making it one. Luke was still asleep when they rode out. She let him sleep. Cole came back in the early afternoon with Brace behind him, and she read his face the moment he dismounted. The contained exterior, the complicated thing underneath it that was not triumph and not relief exactly, but the specific and unsettling experience of watching something become true that you've needed to be true for a long time. Cobb, she said, federal custody. He came up the steps and stopped in front of her. He confirmed Greer killed Margaret, called it an accident. Said Greer acted without direct orders. His jaw tightened. Said he found out after. Do you believe that? He was quiet. I believe Cobb created the conditions and Greer understood what was required. Whether that's better or worse than a direct order, I'm still deciding. She stepped back and let him inside. Brace came in after and laid it out plainly over coffee. Dalby had been taken into custody that morning before they reached the courthouse and had talked at considerable length. Years of working for Cobb had apparently accumulated as pressure he'd been waiting to release. The altered deed records, the backdated signatures, the percentage Cobb took on each acquisition. The land fraud case was strong. Stronger than Brace had expected because Dalby had kept records of his own. He'd always known he might need them. The property claims for displaced families. That's a longer process, Brace said. Federal land restitution takes time, but the mechanism exists and we'll use it. After Brace had gone to sleep, he'd been awake 30 hours. Evelyn and Cole sat alone at the kitchen table, and the house was quiet around them. I saw the ledger, Cole said. Page 114. I could see exactly what she saw. The handwriting difference. She must have compared it against older records to have a baseline. He turned his coffee cup. She was systematic. She didn't guess. She built a case. Yes? She came to me in October and asked about Dalby. I didn't ask her why. He set the cup down. If I'd asked her why, you don't know what would have changed, Evelyn said. You might have stopped her. You might have helped her finish it sooner. You can't know. No, he said. I can't. She looked at him across the table. She left those papers for someone to find. She hid them where they could survive, but where the right person could reach them. She knew she might not get to finish it, and she made sure it could be finished without her. Evelyn paused. That's not someone who felt abandoned. That's someone who trusted that the work mattered more than who got to complete it. Cole looked at her steadily. You couldn't have given her that, Evelyn said. That was hers. That was who she was. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the voice of a man setting something down he's been carrying too long, she deserved better than what happened to her. Yes, Evelyn said, and now Cobb answers for it in federal court, and the families he took from get their land back, and Margaret's name goes into the record as the person who found the evidence. It's not enough, but it's what's available. He looked at the mountains through the window. It's something, he said. It's something, she agreed. They married on a Thursday morning in March. Evelyn chose Thursday because it carried no symbolism, which was exactly what she wanted. Ruth Caswell came with a cake. Pete and Cal came. Garrett Tennant came with his wife, which surprised Evelyn and moved her more than she expected. Cole polished his boots. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Luke stood beside her for the brief formal words. He didn't look at Cole throughout, which was honest, if not generous. But at the end, he shook Cole's hand. A real handshake, deliberate and firm. You take care of her, he said. Cole looked at him. That's a two-way arrangement. Luke thought about it, nodded once. Let go, May cried with full commitment. Henry ate 3 pieces of cake. Daniel hugged Evelyn once without preamble and went back to standing by the window, which was the most Daniel thing that had ever happened and which she would carry for the rest of her life. The federal case against Harlan Cobb took 14 months. When the verdict came, guilty on 11 counts, Evelyn was feeding chickens in the yard and Cole brought Brace's letter out to her. She read it standing in the morning sun with feathers on her coat. She'd expected something larger, some clean release. What she felt instead was smaller and more honest. The quiet recognition that this was right, that it mattered, and also that verdicts don't repair. They stop the damage. They name it. They place consequence where it belongs. But Margaret was still dead, and the tenants had still spent a decade from their land, and those facts existed alongside the verdict and were not resolved by it. Justice was not the same as repair. It was smaller than repair and more difficult, and it was still worth everything they'd done to get it. She would have wanted to see it, Cole said. Yes, Evelyn said. She would have. He was quiet for a moment. I put flowers on her grave last week. First time in over a year. He looked at the mountains. I went because I had something to tell her. About Cobb. About the verdict. He stopped. I know she can't hear it. You went because you needed to say it, Evelyn said. That's reason enough. Her children grew. That was the simple version, and also the true one. Luke ran the north section of the ranch with a competence Cole acknowledged directly and without performance. They arrived at a functional respect that was not fatherhood and not friendship, but was its own honest thing and held. Daniel became a surveyor, which surprised everyone, including Daniel, and then surprised no one at all. Clara taught school in Red Hollow for the rest of her working life, demanding and fair, and occasionally frightening in the way excellent teachers are frightening. May became a veterinarian. The barn cat had seen it coming. Cole and Evelyn had 23 years together before his heart took him in his sleep on a clear January morning. She missed him the way you miss something that's been the furniture of your life. Not sharply, not in the tearing way of early grief, but in the ongoing, pervasive way of absence that lives in ordinary moments. The chair where he sat, the sound of him in the kitchen before she came downstairs. She stayed on the ranch 11 more years after that, until her knees made the argument she couldn't refuse, and then she went to live in Clara's house in Red Hollow and sat on the porch in summers and watched the valley she'd driven into with 9 children and $4 and not much else. She thought about Margaret often, not with guilt, with the specific regard you have for someone you owe something to and cannot pay. Margaret had done her careful work and hidden it and died, and Evelyn had found it and used it and built a life on the ground Margaret had helped to hold. That was not nothing. It was also not payment. It was just the way things go. One person's unrewarded courage becoming another person's foundation. And the not-evenness of that was something Evelyn had learned to carry without bitterness. She carried a lot of things without bitterness by the end. It was less a virtue than a practical decision. Bitterness is expensive, and she had never had much to spare. Luke's daughter found the old survey map years later, clearing out boxes in the storage room. She brought it to Luke on the porch, brittle at the folds. The ink faded, but still legible. He looked at it for a long time. "What is it?" she asked. "The map that tells you who owned what in this valley," he said, "and who tried to take it, and who stopped them." She turned it in her hands. "What happened to the people who tried to take it?" "They lost," Luke said. "Not easily, but they lost." "And the people who stopped them?" He looked at the valley, at the snow still on the peaks, the creek running in the afternoon light, the land that had held because enough people had decided it was worth holding. He thought about his mother arriving in a wagon with nothing much and saying yes to a stranger because the arithmetic of survival required it, and because she was brave in the specific, unglamorous way of people who don't have the option of being otherwise. He thought about a woman he'd never met leaving papers in an inkwell and trusting that someone would come. He thought about being 15 years old on a mountain in the dark, scared the entire way, going anyway. "They built something," he said, "out of what they had." His daughter was quiet for a moment. Was it enough? Luke thought about that honestly, all the way through to the true answer, rather than stopping at the comfortable one. "It was enough to matter," he said. "I think that's what enough means." The afternoon light moved across the valley the way it always had, across the creek and the fences and the mountains and the land that a widow had chosen to stay on when staying was the harder thing. She hadn't arrived with courage. She'd arrived with $4 and 9 children and no good options. The courage had come later, in the choosing, one day at a time, in the cold and the uncertainty and the not knowing whether any of it would hold. That was the only kind of courage that was ever real. The kind that doesn't feel like courage while you're doing it. The kind that looks, from the inside, exactly like just getting through the day. And from the outside, from the long view, from the porch in the afternoon, from the daughter holding a faded map and asking the right questions, it looked like a life worth living, which, in the end, was the whole point.